I sold my logistics empire for $50 million and invited my daughter and her husband to a high-end Chicago steakhouse to celebrate with a bottle of rare wine. But while I stepped away to take a phone call, a young waiter rushed over and whispered, "Sir, your son-in-law just put something in your wine." I did not scream. I did not confront him. I stayed perfectly calm, walked back to the table, quietly switched the glasses and sat back down. 20 minutes later, his arrogant face turned ash pale and the police walked in. He was taken away in handcuffs. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that greed always catches up to those who underestimate the quiet ones. The ink on the $50 million contract was barely dry. For 40 years, I had built my logistics company from a single beaten-up delivery truck into a nationwide fleet. I am 71 years old, a black man who survived the rough streets of the south side of Chicago to sit at the highest tables of corporate America. I learned early on that true power does not need to shout. It observes. It waits. And tonight I was observing the snake sitting across from me at the most exclusive steakhouse in the city, Preston Kensington, my son-in-law. He sat there in his tailored Italian suit, his blonde hair perfectly slicked back, swirling a $300 glass of Merlot. He was the son of old money, or so he liked to project. But I have an eye for details. I saw the slight fraying at the cuffs of his shirt. I noticed the Rolex Submariner on his wrist, and I knew it was a high-quality fake. The second hand ticked just a fraction too aggressively. A man wearing a fake Rolex to a $50 million celebration is a man drowning in a desperate illusion. It must be incredibly surreal for you, Vernon. Preston smiled, though his pale blue eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. I mean, from the projects of Englewood to this, it is quite the American success story. Not bad for a guy who used to load boxes on docks. His tone was dipped in honey but laced with poison. The condescension was a familiar melody. It was the same coded language I had heard from arrogant white executives my entire career. The subtle implication that my success was a fluke, that I was just a thug in a suit who somehow stumbled into a fortune. Preston. Please, my daughter. Maya intervened gently, placing a hand on his arm. Tonight is about celebrating Dad. Maya is my only child, the center of my world. I raised her with everything I never had. Private schools, equestrian lessons, a trust fund. But in my effort to shield her from the harsh realities of the world, I inadvertently made her blind to the wolves that walk among us. She looked at Preston with pure adoration, completely unaware of the rot beneath his charming facade. I am celebrating him, Maya. Preston chuckled, taking a slow sip of his wine. I am just saying Vernon has had a long, exhausting run. It is good that he is finally cashing out. Time to let the new generation handle the heavy lifting. Speaking of which, Vernon, my consulting firm is expanding. We should discuss integrating some of your new liquid capital into our portfolios. I cut into my steak, my movements deliberate and unhurried. Hard work does pay off, Preston. But tell me, how exactly is your firm doing? I read the market reports. It seems your client retention has dropped significantly this quarter. Preston flinched. The mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the raw, panicked desperation underneath. His jaw tightened and the vein in his neck throbbed. He recovered quickly, offering a tight defensive smile. Just a temporary market fluctuation, Vernon. You know how the economy is, or maybe you do not, since your business model is a bit outdated, but we are doing perfectly fine. I knew he was lying. My private accountants had already run a background check on his so-called elite consulting firm. Preston was bleeding money. He was leveraged to the breaking point, drowning in debt and desperate for a lifeline. And tonight, sitting across from him, I was a $50 million lifeline. Before Preston could attempt another passive-aggressive insult, the phone in my breast pocket vibrated. It was the lead attorney for the acquisition group. The final wire transfers were being processed. "Excuse me for a moment," I said, dabbing my mouth with the linen napkin. "I need to take this. Please enjoy the wine." I stood up and navigated through the dimly lit mahogany-paneled dining room. The restaurant hummed with the quiet, expensive conversations of Chicago's elite. I stepped out into the quiet hallway near the private dining rooms to answer the call. The attorney confirmed that the funds would be fully accessible in my primary accounts by midnight. The deal was officially done. I thanked him, ended the call, and turned to head back to my table. As I rounded the corner, I nearly bumped into Trey, a young African-American waiter I had tipped generously earlier in the evening. Trey was a good kid working double shifts to pay his way through architectural school, but right now his hands were shaking so badly that the silver tray he was holding rattled. His eyes were wide with panic. Mr. Caldwell. Trey whispered, his voice barely audible over the ambient jazz music drifting from the main dining room. "Sir, I need to tell you something." "Take a breath, son," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "What is wrong?" Trey looked nervously over his shoulder toward the dining room. "I was refilling water at the table behind yours." "Sir, I saw it in the reflection of the decorative mirror on the wall. Your daughter went to the restroom, and your son-in-law, he reached into his jacket pocket." Trey swallowed hard, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute terror. He pulled out a small capsule. He twisted it open and dropped a white powder directly into your glass of Merlot. He swirled the glass until it dissolved. "Sir, he poisoned your wine." The hallway seemed to drop in temperature. I did not gasp. I did not curse. My mind, trained by decades of ruthless corporate negotiations and street survival, instantly shifted into a cold, hyper-focused gear. I analyzed the board. The $50 million was liquid tonight. If I died of a sudden, unexplained heart attack this evening before I could officially move those funds into the protective trusts I had set up for Maya, she would inherit everything directly as my next of kin. And Maya, sweet, trusting Maya, was completely under Preston's control. He would have his hands on $50 million by the end of the week. Preston was not just a failing businessman. He was a predator backed into a corner, and he had just made his move. "Are you absolutely sure about what you saw, Trey?" I asked, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "I swear on my mother's life, Mr. Caldwell. I saw it clear as day. I did not know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I tell the manager? No." I placed a firm, reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "You did exactly the right thing by coming to me. Do not call the manager. Do not say a word to anyone yet. Go to the kitchen, find a quiet corner, and wait for my signal. I will handle this." Trey nodded quickly and hurried down the service corridor. I stood alone in the hallway for exactly 10 seconds. I smoothed the lapels of my suit jacket. I controlled my breathing, slowing my heart rate. Anger is a useless emotion if it is not channeled into precise action. Preston thought he was dealing with a tired old man. He forgot that I survived a world that would have eaten him alive before breakfast. I walked back into the dining room, my posture straight, my expression completely neutral. When I approached the table, Maya was just returning from the restroom, taking her seat. Preston was leaning back in his chair, a faint, anticipating smirk playing on his lips. He looked at my half-full glass of Merlot, then looked at me. "Everything in order with the sale?" Preston asked, his voice dripping with faux concern. "Everything is perfectly in order." I smiled, pulling my chair out. "The funds are secure." I sat down. My glass of Merlot sat exactly where I had left it, the dark red liquid catching the dim light of the candle on the table. Preston's glass sat across from me, identical in shape and volume. "Well then," Preston said, picking up his glass, "I believe a toast is in order." "Just a moment," I said, reaching for my napkin. As I pulled the heavy cloth napkin onto my lap, I deliberately hooked my finger under the edge of my heavy silver steak knife. I swept it off the edge of the table. The heavy silver hit the hardwood floor with a loud, sharp clatter that echoed in our quiet corner of the restaurant. "Oh, my apologies," I said, projecting embarrassment. "My hands are a bit clumsy tonight." Maya sighed with a fond smile, and both she and Preston instinctively leaned over, looking down at the floor to locate the fallen knife beneath the draped tablecloth. In that split second, while their eyes were diverted beneath the table, my hands moved with a speed and precision born from decades of surviving the unexpected. I did not hesitate. I reached across the small table, grabbed the stem of my spiked glass, and smoothly swapped it with Preston's identical glass. It took less than 1 second. Silent. Flawless. By the time Preston sat back up, shaking his head with a condescending chuckle, my hands were resting peacefully in my lap. A busboy hurried over to retrieve the fallen knife and replace it with a clean one. As I was saying, Preston continued oblivious to the fact that the Grim Reaper had just changed seats. He lifted the glass of Merlot, the very glass he had spiked minutes earlier. The candlelight danced in his pale eyes, reflecting a greed so deep it was almost palpable. "You have had a long, hard life, Vernon. You built an empire. But the world is changing. It is time to step aside and let the new blood take over. To the future, old man. He held the glass out toward me. I looked at him. I looked at the dark red wine swirling in his glass. I picked up my newly acquired perfectly safe wine. I raised it, holding his gaze with an icy, unblinking stare. To the future, Preston, I said softly, my voice carrying a weight he was too arrogant to understand. Drink up. Preston smirked, brought the rim of the glass to his lips, and took a long, deep swallow. I took a sip of my own wine, savoring the rich, complex flavor. The countdown had officially begun. I watched the dark liquid disappear down Preston's throat. He swallowed the Merlot with the greedy gulp of a man who believed he had just secured his financial empire. I took a slow sip of my own wine. It tasted like absolute justice. I placed my crystal glass down on the white tablecloth and looked at the antique grandfather clock standing near the entrance of the private dining room. It was exactly 8:15 in the evening. The countdown had begun. Preston wiped his mouth with his linen napkin and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table in a display of relaxed dominance. He was already spending my $50 million in his head. "You know, Vernon," he said, gesturing with his heavy silver fork, "$50 million is a solid baseline to retire on. But sitting in a traditional bank, it is practically depreciating. Inflation eats it alive. What you need is aggressive wealth management. My firm has access to exclusive offshore portfolios. We could take a large chunk of that capital, say 20 or 30 million, and double it in 5 years. You would not have to lift a finger." I looked at his eager, flushed face. He was pitching me a lifeline for his own sinking ship. My private investigators had already pulled the curtain back on his so-called elite consulting firm. Preston Kensington was not a financial genius. He was a desperate fraud. He had leveraged his wealthy family name to attract high-net-worth clients, and then he lost their money in reckless high-yield gambles. His firm was currently bleeding capital at an unsustainable rate. He was over $12 million in the red. If he did not inject massive liquidity into his accounts by the end of the month, the federal authorities would be knocking on his door. Or worse, the dangerous private creditors he had borrowed from would come collecting. That was exactly why he needed me dead tonight. He needed my daughter Maya to inherit my fortune immediately so he could drain her accounts and save his own skin. Maya reached out and affectionately squeezed his hand. "Preston is right, Dad," she said, her eyes full of misplaced admiration. "He has done amazing things for his clients. It would be wonderful if you two could finally work together. You could relax and let him handle the stress of the markets. You have worked hard enough." I smiled at my daughter, my beautiful, trusting daughter. I had spent my entire life protecting her from the viciousness of the world, and in doing so, I had inadvertently left her completely defenseless against a predator in a tailored suit. "I will take it under advisement, Maya," I said softly. "But tonight, let us just enjoy the meal and celebrate the present." The antique clock ticked to 8:25. 10 minutes had passed. Preston was talking rapidly now, his voice slightly elevated and strained. He was boasting about an expensive golf trip he was planning to Pebble Beach, but I noticed the subtle, undeniable physical changes. A thin sheen of cold sweat had formed on his forehead. He reached up and nervously loosened his silk tie, pulling at the stiff collar of his designer shirt. "It is incredibly warm in here, do you not think?" he asked, looking around the upscale restaurant with darting eyes. "The air conditioning must be broken." Maya looked confused. "Really?" she asked, touching her own arms. "I feel perfectly fine." "Maybe you drank the wine too fast, honey." Preston shook his head, blinking hard as if trying to clear his vision. "No, it is definitely stuffy in here." He grabbed his glass of ice water and took a massive, desperate gulp. I watched him like a hawk studying a trapped mouse. The poison he had used was a highly advanced synthetic chemical designed specifically to mimic a massive, sudden myocardial infarction. It was entirely untraceable, meant to leave the medical examiner with no choice but to rule it a natural heart attack brought on by my advanced age and corporate stress. It was the perfect silent weapon to use against a 71-year-old man. But inside the body of a much younger man, the chemical was accelerating, tearing through his cardiovascular system with violent, unpredictable speed. By 8:30, 15 minutes into the countdown, Preston was no longer talking about golf or wealth management. His suffocating arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by a deep, silent panic. His skin had turned a sickly, ashen shade of gray. He was gripping the thick edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. "Preston, are you okay?" Maya asked, her voice trembling with sudden, genuine alarm. "You look terrible." "I am fine," he gasped, though his breathing was becoming terrifyingly shallow and ragged. "Just a little indigestion. The Wagyu steak must have been too rich." He tried to force a reassuring smile for her, but it contorted into a painful grimace. I continued to cut my steak, my hands perfectly steady. I chewed slowly, savoring the rich flavor of the meat. I knew exactly what was happening inside his chest. His arteries were violently constricting. The vital blood flow to his brain was being restricted. The poison was doing the exact lethal work he had intended for me. The grandfather clock chimed the half hour. 8:35. 20 minutes exactly. Preston suddenly let out a strangled, guttural gasp that sounded barely human. His pale blue eyes went wide with absolute primal terror. He clutched the center of his chest with both hands, his fingers digging into his expensive shirt as if he were trying to physically rip his own heart out to relieve the agonizing pressure. "Vernon," he choked out, looking directly at me with wild, pleading eyes. "Help me!" And then his entire body violently convulsed. He pitched forward with brutal, uncontrollable force. His face slammed directly into the center of the table. Fine china dinner plates shattered into 100 jagged pieces. Crystal wine glasses tipped over spilling ice water, and expensive Merlot across the pristine white tablecloth like a pool of fresh blood. Silverware clattered loudly to the hardwood floor. The elegant, sophisticated silence of the steakhouse was instantly obliterated. Diners at nearby tables jumped out of their seats in shock. Maya let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed off the high ceilings. "Preston!" she shrieked, falling to her knees beside his convulsing body, completely ruining her silk dress on the floor. "Oh my God, somebody help him, please. He is having a heart attack." She was sobbing uncontrollably, her hands frantically hovering over his seizing form, terrified to touch him. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice. I stood up calmly and smoothed the front of my suit jacket. Trey, the young waiter who had warned me, was already rushing over, his eyes wide but remarkably focused. "Mr. Caldwell," Trey said breathlessly, looking at the chaos. "Trey," I said, my voice cutting through the hysteria of the dining room like a cold steel blade. "Call an ambulance immediately. And Trey, call the police. Tell the dispatcher there has been an attempted murder." Maya looked up at me from the floor, her face stained with black mascara and sheer disbelief. "What are you talking about, Dad?" she cried out, her voice cracking. "It is his heart. He needs a doctor, not the police." I looked down at my weeping daughter, feeling a deep pang of sorrow for the emotional pain she was about to endure. But I knew this harsh awakening was absolutely necessary for her survival. "Just hold on, Maya," I said gently but firmly. "Help is on the way." The wailing sirens echoed in the city distance, growing louder and more urgent by the second. Within minutes, highly trained paramedics burst through the heavy front doors of the restaurant, rushing toward our table with a stretcher and heavy medical equipment bags. They forcefully hoisted Preston onto the open floor, ripping open his ruined shirt to attach defibrillator pads to his pale, violently sweating chest. As the medical team fought desperately to stabilize his erratic, fading heartbeat, 2 uniformed police officers and a stern, plainclothes detective walked directly into the dining area. While the police began aggressively securing the scene and questioning the panicked restaurant manager, Trey walked slowly past me. He did not make obvious eye contact, but as he casually brushed my arm, he discreetly slipped a small, cold object into the palm of my hand. It was a silver USB drive. He had successfully downloaded the security footage from the hidden camera in the VIP hallway. I walked over to the detective, a tall, hard-looking man with a badge clipped to his belt. "Detective," I said, extending my hand with absolute authority. "Vernon Caldwell. I am the one who instructed the staff to call you." The detective looked from me to Preston's lifeless-looking body on the floor. "Care to explain why you reported an attempted homicide, sir?" he asked, his tone heavy with skepticism. "Looks like a standard unfortunate cardiac event to me." I gestured toward the empty leather booth next to us where I had left my leather briefcase. I smoothly pulled out my slim laptop, powered it on, and inserted the silver USB drive. "I believe this will completely clarify the situation for you, Detective," I said, turning the bright screen toward him. I clicked play. The high-definition footage showed the secluded hallway perfectly. It clearly showed Preston looking around nervously to ensure he was alone. It showed him reaching into his tailored jacket and pulling a small capsule from his pocket. It showed him dumping the unknown white powder directly into my specific glass of wine and swirling it until the evidence completely dissolved. The detective stared intently at the screen, his jaw tightening as he processed the visual evidence. He demanded to watch the footage a second time. Then he looked up at me, his eyes widening slightly as he realized the deadly implications of the glass swap that had obviously occurred off-camera. The paramedics had barely managed to shock Preston's failing heart back into a fragile, uneven rhythm. They strapped his limp body onto the metal stretcher covering his bare chest with a standard-issue blue hospital blanket. He was barely conscious, his eyelids fluttering open, filled with immense physical pain and heavy confusion. As they began to rapidly wheel him away toward the waiting ambulance, the lead detective stepped directly into their path. "Hold up," the detective commanded loudly. The paramedics immediately paused the gurney. The detective pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his leather belt. He leaned aggressively over the stretcher and snapped the cold metal cuffs tightly around Preston's pale wrist, locking the other end directly to the thick metal rail of the medical gurney. "Preston Kensington, you are under arrest for attempted murder," the detective stated with absolute authority, his voice echoing in the completely stunned restaurant. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Maya screamed again, trying desperately to lunge forward to protect her husband, but a uniformed officer firmly held her back. Preston turned his head weakly against the thin hospital pillow. His blurry, panic-stricken eyes frantically searched the crowd until they found mine. The sheer terror of realization washed over his pale face as his clouded mind understood exactly what had happened. I stepped close to the moving stretcher, leaning down so only he could hear me over the chaotic noise of the sirens and the shouting crowd. "You drank from the wrong cup, son." The harsh fluorescent lights of the Chicago Memorial Hospital waiting room buzzed with a cold mechanical hum. It was a stark, blinding contrast to the warm, elegant candlelight of the steakhouse we had left behind just an hour ago. I sat on a stiff vinyl chair with my hands folded, resting patiently on my knees. I watched my daughter Maya pace back and forth across the scuffed linoleum floor. Her beautiful pale silk dress was stained with spilled wine and ruined from falling to the floor. Her mascara was smeared heavily beneath her eyes, leaving dark, tragic shadows on her cheeks. She was clutching her mobile phone tightly to her chest as if it were a life preserver in a raging ocean. I remained completely silent. I did not try to comfort her with empty words because there was no comfort to be found in the harsh reality we were about to face. I knew exactly what was happening behind the heavy closed doors of the emergency ward. The medical staff were aggressively pumping the dangerous synthetic poison out of Preston, and the armed police officers were standing guard waiting patiently for him to wake up. I watched the second hand on the wall clock tick away the minutes, feeling the heavy weight of the night pressing down on my shoulders. I had built my entire existence around protecting my family, but tonight the threat had come from sitting directly at my own dinner table. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed down the sterile corridor. The lead detective from the restaurant approached us. His expression was grim, professional, and entirely devoid of sympathy. He held a thin manila folder tightly in his right hand. Maya stopped her frantic pacing and rushed toward him, begging wildly for any news about her husband. The detective looked at her with a mixture of professional pity and hardened police detachment. He then looked directly at me. He opened the folder and read aloud from the preliminary toxicology report. The blood work came back extremely fast due to the severe and unusual nature of the sudden cardiac event. The detective stated flatly that Preston absolutely did not suffer a natural heart attack. He explained that the laboratory technicians found lethal concentrated traces of a highly sophisticated synthetic chemical circulating heavily in his bloodstream. It was not a common recreational drug or a simple sedative designed to put someone to sleep. It was a military-grade neurotoxin specifically engineered to trigger a massive and instantly fatal myocardial infarction. The chemical was ingeniously designed to wash completely out of the human cardiovascular system within a few short hours, leaving absolutely no trace for a standard county coroner to find during an autopsy. The detective closed the folder with a sharp snap and looked me dead in the eye. He said that if I had taken even a single small sip from that spiked glass of Merlot, I would be lying on a cold steel slab in the city morgue right now. He explained the sinister motive with brutal, chilling clarity. If I had died before the massive $50 million logistics company sale was officially finalized, the massive corporate funds would have transferred directly and automatically into my personal estate. As my only living legal heir, Maya would have inherited everything immediately. And as her legal husband, Preston, would have gained complete unrestricted access to my entire life savings by tomorrow morning. "He intended to murder you, Mr. Caldwell," the detective said, his voice heavy with grim, absolute certainty. "He wanted you dead before midnight." The terrible words hung heavily in the cold hospital air like a physical, suffocating weight. I fully expected Maya to collapse to the floor or perhaps burst into tears of horrific realization. Instead, a terrifying and unnatural transformation came over her beautiful face. Her delicate features hardened quickly into a rigid mask of pure, desperate denial. She shook her head violently, stepping backward away from the tall detective as if he had just threatened to strike her physically. She raised her voice, screaming loudly that the police officers were lying. She accused the experienced detective of gross incompetence and insisted frantically that there must have been a terrible mix-up with the blood work at the hospital laboratory. She yelled passionately that Preston was a good man from a highly respectable, wealthy family and that he would never, ever do something so incredibly monstrous. The detective tried to calmly explain that they already possessed the clear security footage from the restaurant showing Preston actively dropping the white powder into the wine glass. But Maya stubbornly refused to listen to reason or logic. Her rising panic twisted rapidly into a vicious, irrational anger, and she suddenly turned that blazing anger directly onto me. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at my face and unleashed a vicious torrent of deeply hurtful accusations. "You did this!" she cried out, her voice breaking with wild, misplaced rage. "You have always hated him from the very first day. You have always looked down on him because he is white and because he comes from a wealthy, established family. You never thought he was good enough for me, and now you are using your vast money and your dark influence to frame him for a crime he did not commit." She accused me of switching the wine glasses on purpose not to save my own life from a deadly poison, but to maliciously harm her innocent husband and deliberately ruin her perfect marriage. Every single word she spoke felt like a jagged, rusted knife twisting deep into my chest. I had spent my entire adult life shielding her from pain and hardship. I had worked exhausting double shifts hauling heavy wooden crates on the freezing docks of the South Side just so she could sleep in a warm, incredibly safe bed every night. I had built a massive $50 million corporate empire from absolutely nothing solely to ensure she would never ever know the bitter, degrading taste of poverty or discrimination. And now, here she was, aggressively defending the very man who had coldly calculated my execution. I looked deeply at her tear-stained face, and I clearly saw the devastating, successful extent of Preston and his relentless psychological manipulation. He had spent years slowly isolating her and subtly feeding her toxic lies about my character and my intentions. He had convinced her that my natural protective instincts were actually forms of toxic control, and that my quiet observation of people was actually malicious, unfair judgment. He had methodically brainwashed my own precious daughter into seeing me as the controlling villain of her life story. But I did not raise my voice to argue with her. I did not try to passionately defend myself against her wild, baseless accusations. I simply remained sitting upright on the stiff vinyl chair, absorbing every single ounce of her profound hatred in complete, unwavering silence. A truly wise man knows that you can never use rational logic to pull someone out of a deep emotional delusion. Arguing with her now would only push her further into his waiting psychological trap. I had to let her completely exhaust her burning anger. I had to let the cold, undeniable truth slowly dismantle her false reality piece by painful piece. So I sat quietly, gripping my knees, and let my only daughter tell me exactly how much she despised me. It was a bitter pill to swallow, hearing my own flesh and blood use the very differences I had overcome to justify his innocence. She accused me of hating him because he was white and born into old money. The truth was, I never cared about the color of his skin or the size of his trust fund. I only cared about the actual content of his character. But Preston and his arrogant parents had always used their polished country club pedigree as a convenient shield to hide their deep moral bankruptcy. They looked at my calloused hands and my humble South Side origins and saw only a lesser man who had simply gotten lucky in business. They never respected my intellect or my relentless work ethic, and far worse, they had subtly taught my daughter to look at me through that same distorted lens of class prejudice. They made her believe that my disciplined approach to wealth was just the paranoid hoarding of an uneducated laborer. I realized sitting there in the harsh hospital light that Preston did not just want to steal my money. He wanted to completely erase my legacy and replace it with his own unearned superiority. He wanted to take my life and then take my place. Maya eventually ran completely out of breath. She collapsed heavily into a cheap plastic chair across the waiting room, burying her face deeply in her hands and sobbing loudly into the quiet hospital corridor. The lead detective gave me a brief sympathetic nod before walking away to coordinate the incoming criminal charges with the district attorney. The hospital ward fell into a tense, miserable, heavy silence, broken only by the pathetic sound of my daughter crying desperately for the greedy man who actively wanted me dead. I took a slow, deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart and clear my troubled mind. I needed to focus entirely on the next critical step of the battle ahead of me. But before I could formulate a solid defensive plan, my phone began to vibrate violently in the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled it out slowly and looked down at the glowing digital screen. It was my primary wealth management banker calling me at a highly unusual and inappropriate hour. I answered the call immediately, keeping my voice deliberately low and perfectly steady. The senior banker sounded incredibly nervous and hesitant. He apologized profusely before delivering the completely crushing news to me. The massive $50 million wire transfer had been abruptly and indefinitely frozen by the corporate acquisition group. The wealthy buyers had already caught wind of the dramatic, chaotic arrest at the high-end steakhouse. In the ruthless, fast-paced world of high-level corporate acquisitions, absolutely nobody wants to inherit a massive public scandal involving attempted murder and active police investigations. The powerful buyers were officially pulling out of the deal entirely, citing a massive breach of faith and severe reputational risk to their global holding company. The anxious banker explained quietly that the massive funds had been permanently locked in an escrow account and were currently being aggressively reversed by the foreign banks. The money was completely gone. I lowered the phone slowly from my ear, staring blankly at the sterile hospital wall. Preston had failed to kill me tonight, but his reckless, disgusting greed had just detonated my entire life work. The $50 million was completely frozen, and my only daughter was treating me like a criminal monster. The real brutal war had just begun. The heavy automatic double doors of the emergency ward swung open with a violent mechanical force that made the exhausted triage nurses physically flinch in their seats. In walked Richard and Catherine Kensington. They did not walk like normal anxious parents visiting a sick relative in a public city hospital. They walked like arrogant, conquering monarchs who were forced to temporarily step foot into a highly disappointing and filthy foreign territory. I watched them approach from my stiff, uncomfortable vinyl chair in the waiting area. Richard was an impossibly tall and rigid man with thick silver hair that remained perfectly coiffed despite the chaotic late hour of the night. He wore a bespoke navy blue cashmere overcoat draped elegantly over a perfectly tailored dark charcoal suit. His face was sharp and highly angular, permanently set in an expression of deep aristocratic disdain and perpetual dissatisfaction. Catherine walked exactly one step behind him, clutching a rare imported crocodile skin handbag tightly against her waist, as if it were a defensive weapon. She wore a pristine, snow-white wool trench coat that seemed entirely out of place in the sterile clinical environment of the trauma center. Heavy, flawless diamond earrings hung from her earlobes, catching the harsh fluorescent hospital lights with every arrogant turn of her head. They were the absolute living embodiment of 4 generations of inherited, untouched wealth. They were the specific kind of people who truly believed that severe consequences and criminal laws were simply inconvenient things that only applied to the lower working classes of society. Flanking the wealthy couple was a sharply dressed man I recognized immediately from the cover pages of elite financial magazines. He was a notoriously aggressive, high-powered criminal defense attorney, well known for quietly making federal felony charges disappear for the city's most privileged elite. He carried a thick, genuine leather briefcase and immediately began speaking rapidly and aggressively to the frustrated lead detective. I watched quietly and intensely as the expensive lawyer slammed a heavily stamped legal document directly onto the front counter of the nurse's station. It was a perfectly executed emergency judicial order. Within mere minutes of Preston being formally arrested at the restaurant, Richard had already utilized his vast political connections to contact a sleeping state judge, who happened to be a long-standing board member of their exclusive private country club. They were forcefully posting a massive $1 million bail using a combination of liquid cash and certified bearer bonds. They were completely bypassing the entire standard police booking process, using their overwhelming financial leverage to literally buy their son out of handcuffs before the poison had even fully left his bloodstream. The lead detective looked absolutely disgusted, his jaw clenching tightly with silent outrage, but his hands were legally completely tied by the corrupt judicial signature on the paper. I sat perfectly still, observing the raw, terrifying power of old money moving with ruthless, blinding speed to protect its own guilty blood. Richard Kensington suddenly spotted me sitting alone in the dim corner of the waiting area. His pale blue eyes narrowed instantly with pure, concentrated venom. He left his high-priced shark lawyer barking commands at the frustrated police officers and marched aggressively directly toward me. His expensive, handcrafted Italian leather shoes clicked sharply and rhythmically against the cheap, scuffed hospital linoleum floor. I did not stand up to greet him. I did not offer him a single ounce of the respect he felt entitled to receive. I remained firmly seated, keeping my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly on my knees, and my facial expression completely unreadable and emotionally void. Richard stopped just 2 short feet away from me, intentionally invading my personal physical space in a deliberate, desperate attempt to physically intimidate me. He looked forcefully down his narrow, aristocratic nose at my face, treating me like a piece of dirt on the bottom of his shoe. "You really thought you could easily pull this ridiculous stunt off, did you not, Vernon?" Richard spoke in a low, harsh, hateful whisper deliberately designed to carry maximum venom and disrespect without causing a loud public scene that might attract unwanted media attention. He sneered at me with a look of absolute, profound disgust. "You actually thought you could maliciously frame my only son to somehow get out of sharing your little logistics payout with our family. I know exactly what kind of pathetic game you are playing right now. You can dress yourself up in expensive Italian suits and buy exclusive tables at high-end restaurant dinners, but underneath all of that fake polish, you are still just a desperate street hustler from the dangerous slums of the South Side. You have a permanent ghetto mentality, Vernon. You are nothing but a common thug in a business suit who simply got lucky in the corporate world. You secretly hate us because we represent absolutely everything you can never ever buy with your dirty money. You lack class, you lack breeding, you lack pedigree. You set my innocent boy up tonight because you are a paranoid, jealous old fool who absolutely cannot stand the fact that your daughter married into a vastly superior family bloodline." I listened to his deeply coded racist language without blinking a single eye. He was enthusiastically using the exact same tired, predictable insults I had heard from mediocre, insecure men my entire professional life. Men who were incredibly lucky to be born on third base, and then spent their entire useless lives loudly bragging to everyone that they had hit a spectacular triple. Richard Kensington had never actually built a single thing with his own 2 bare hands. He had only passively inherited massive wealth and systematically squandered it. I did not raise my voice in anger or react emotionally to his pathetic, childish provocation. I simply looked deep into his pale, angry eyes and spoke with cold, terrifying, absolute certainty. "Your son put a lethal, untraceable synthetic toxin directly into my glass of wine, Richard. The police currently have the high-definition security footage showing him doing it. The emergency room doctors have the undisputed blood work proving the poison is in his system. All of your ancient pedigree and country club memberships cannot change the simple, undeniable fact that you raised a weak, desperate, cowardly murderer who tried to kill an old man for a paycheck." Richard's face instantly turned a violent, unhealthy shade of dark purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. He opened his mouth to shout a furious denial, but Catherine stepped gracefully and quickly around him, firmly placing a manicured hand on his soft cashmere sleeve to physically stop him from losing control. She looked down at me with cold, dead, empty eyes that strongly reminded me of a great white shark silently circling a bleeding, helpless prey in the open ocean. She did not bother with loud, aggressive insults or obvious racist dog whistles. She was calculating and far more dangerous than her emotionally fragile husband. Catherine leaned in incredibly close to my face so that only I could smell the overpowering, cloying scent of her expensive, custom-imported perfume. "We are going to completely and utterly destroy you, Vernon," she whispered, her voice dripping with pure, refined malice and absolute confidence. "We have deep personal friends in every major media outlet in this state. We completely own the public narrative in this city. By the time we are permanently finished with you, The entire world will truly believe that you are a severely senile, violent old man who tragically tried to poison his own son-in-law to selfishly protect his hoarded retirement money. Your company stock will plummet into the ground. Your professional reputation will be ground entirely into the dirty pavement. And most importantly, we are taking Maya away from you. She fully belongs to our family now. You will never, ever see your precious daughter again. Before I could even formulate a verbal response to her vile threat, the heavy double doors leading to the secure emergency treatment room suddenly swung open. Two uniformed police officers reluctantly wheeled Preston out into the main corridor in a standard hospital wheelchair. He looked physically terrible, pale, shaking, and covered in a sheen of cold sweat, but the smug, arrogant, entitled smirk was already rapidly returning to his face, now that his powerful, wealthy parents had officially arrived to rescue him from facing any real consequences. Maya, who had been quietly weeping in a corner chair, immediately ran directly to his side, completely ignoring my physical presence in the room. Catherine immediately walked over to Maya and aggressively wrapped her arms tightly around her shoulders in a sickeningly dramatic display of fake maternal affection. "Oh, my poor, sweet, innocent girl!" Catherine cooed loudly, intentionally projecting her voice so everyone in the room could hear her stroking Maya hair with exaggerated concern. "Thank God we got here in time to save you from this nightmare. We are taking you both home right now to the estate. You are completely safe from him now, Maya." Maya leaned heavily into Catherine's shoulder, sobbing quietly and nodding her head in agreement. She did not even bother to look back at me, not even a single quick glance. She simply grabbed Preston's cold hand and helped him slowly stand up from the wheelchair as the aggressive defense lawyer loudly cleared their physical path to the hospital exit doors. I sat completely alone in the cold, sterile hospital corridor and silently watched the wealthy Kensington family walk proudly out through the automatic sliding glass doors, taking my only beloved daughter far away from me. The oppressive heavy silence of the emergency waiting room pressed down heavily against my chest, making it slightly difficult to breathe. A weaker man would have completely broken down and cried openly in despair. A lesser man would have foolishly chased after them through the parking lot, screaming frantically and begging his brainwashed daughter to please see the undeniable truth. But I am absolutely not a weak man. I am a hardened survivor who knows perfectly well that the absolute best time to accurately strike a dangerous enemy is when they arrogantly and confidently turn their exposed back on you. I reached calmly into my tailored jacket pocket and pulled out my mobile phone. I scrolled slowly past the long list of useless corporate contacts and deliberately dialed a highly secure private phone number that I had not called in many years. The phone rang exactly twice before a deep, gruff voice answered the line. It was Marcus, an incredibly loyal old friend and a brilliantly ruthless retired forensic accountant who owed me his entire life and career. "Marcus," I said, my voice dropping as cold and brutally hard as solid reinforced concrete. "I need you to completely and mercilessly tear the Kensington family apart piece by piece. Dig deeply into every single offshore account they secretly own. Find every hidden corporate shell company they operate. Find me every single dirty dollar they have ever touched in their miserable lives. They arrogantly want a war over my legacy and my daughter. I am going to give them an absolute financial slaughter." The morning sun brought no warmth to my empty apartment. It only brought the harsh, blinding light of the media war that Richard and Catherine Kensington had ruthlessly unleashed overnight. I sat in my leather armchair and watched the local news channel in absolute silence. The polished news anchor was reading a breaking story that had been expertly planted by the Kensington public relations machine. The headlines scrolling across the bottom of the television screen made my blood run entirely cold. It read, "71-year-old paranoid businessman poisons his own drink to frame his son-in-law." They had completely flipped the narrative. The wealthy family used their deep connections to feed the press a highly twisted version of the events at the steakhouse. They painted me as a deeply unstable, senile man who was violently obsessed with controlling his daughter and hoarding his wealth. They claimed I had deliberately dropped the synthetic chemical into my own glass of Merlot and then swapped it with Preston to create a false attempted murder scenario. They hired expensive psychologists to go on national television and confidently diagnose me with severe paranoid dementia from afar. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare and character assassination. Every single local morning show dedicated their entire broadcast to dissecting my background, my business history, and my completely fabricated mental deterioration. The commentators sat in their comfortable, bright studios wearing expensive makeup and nodding sympathetically while discussing the supposed tragedy of a wealthy black business mogul losing his mind and attacking his innocent white son-in-law. They wanted the world to believe I was a monster. The financial consequences of their vicious smear campaign were immediate and utterly devastating. By the time the stock market opened, my logistics company took a catastrophic hit. The share prices plummeted 20% in the first hour of trading. Investors were panicking and dumping their stock as fast as humanly possible. My corporate phone rang constantly with frantic calls from nervous shareholders and angry partners. By noon, I received a formal, legally binding notice from my own board of directors. The very men and women I had personally enriched for decades were now aggressively turning their backs on me. They demanded an emergency board meeting to formally discuss my immediate removal from the position of chief executive officer. They cited the morality clause in my contract, claiming my severe public scandal and alleged mental decline were an existential threat to the survival of the corporation. I had spent 40 long years building that company from a single rusty delivery truck into a nationwide empire. Now, a group of terrified men in expensive suits wanted to strip it all away from me simply because they were afraid of bad press. They sent couriers to my apartment demanding that I surrender my corporate access keys and step down peacefully before they forced me out in public. It was a cowardly betrayal by people I had trusted with my entire professional legacy. The legal battle was equally frustrating and deeply corrupt. I drove to the downtown police precinct expecting to see Preston being formally processed for his crimes. Instead, the lead detective met me in a sterile interrogation room with a look of profound defeat on his tired face. He explained that the high-powered defense attorney hired by Richard Kensington had successfully stalled the entire criminal investigation. The slick lawyer had formally petitioned the court to suppress the restaurant security footage. He creatively argued that the camera angle was inherently misleading and that the grainy video did not definitively show what type of powder was dropped into the glass. He planted the seeds of reasonable doubt, claiming it could have been a simple antacid or a harmless breath mint. The lawyer also aggressively pushed the false narrative that I was the one who had secretly acquired the military-grade neurotoxin through my old neighborhood street connections. Because I was the one who initiated the glass swap, the defense lawyer argued that I was the actual aggressor who forced his innocent client to drink the poison. The exhausted detective told me that the district attorney was now extremely hesitant to press formal attempted murder charges against a wealthy white socialite without a totally airtight case. The justice system was working exactly as it was designed to work for the ultra-rich. It was protecting them while simultaneously putting me on trial for surviving an assassination attempt. The detective looked completely helpless against the crushing weight of old money influence. He apologized quietly to me, saying he had never seen a defense attorney move with such aggressive speed to bury physical evidence and twist the narrative into absolute fiction. He warned me that if I pushed the issue too hard right now, the district attorney might actually consider charging me with reckless endangerment just to appease the wealthy Kensington family and stop the relentless media circus they had created. I thanked the detective for his honest time and walked slowly out of the noisy precinct. I left the police station feeling the heavy, oppressive weight of the corrupt city pressing down on my chest. A weaker man would have completely surrendered to the despair. A lesser man would have called a massive press conference to angrily defend his damaged honor or tearfully beg the unforgiving public for sympathy. But I am not a loud, emotional man. I do not fight my battles in the noisy court of public opinion, where the truth is easily manipulated by whoever has the most money. I fight my battles in the deep, quiet shadows, where the absolute truth is measured in cold, hard numbers and undeniable facts. I knew that engaging with the corrupt media would only give the Kensington family more ammunition to use against me in the brutal court of public opinion. I knew that showing any public emotion would be immediately branded as dangerous, erratic behavior by their paid television psychologists. So I remained completely invisible to the hungry reporters camping aggressively outside my corporate office building. I did not go to the press. I drove my dark sedan to a small, rundown diner on the far south side of the city. It was a modest, quiet place far away from the flashing cameras and the wealthy downtown elites. The bell above the glass door jingled softly as I walked inside the warm building. Marcus was already sitting in a back corner booth waiting patiently for me. He was wearing a faded brown corduroy jacket and drinking a cup of black coffee. He looked like an ordinary, tired old man, but behind his thick, wire-rimmed glasses was one of the most brilliant and ruthless financial minds in the entire country. Marcus was a retired forensic accountant who specialized in dismantling complex corporate fraud and tracking hidden money across international borders. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him without saying a single word. The young waitress came over and poured me a cup of hot coffee, but I did not touch it. I simply looked directly at Marcus, waiting for the crucial information I desperately needed to fight this war. Marcus did not offer any warm greetings or useless apologies for my current public nightmare. He understood the severe gravity of the situation. He reached into his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. He slid it slowly across the scratched Formica table until it rested directly in front of my hands. I looked down at the plain cardboard cover, feeling a sudden strange sense of dark anticipation. This was the silent weapon I was going to use to completely destroy the Kensington family. I opened the folder. The first few pages were highly classified bank statements and heavily redacted wire transfer logs. Marcus leaned forward and spoke in a low, gravelly voice. He told me that he had spent the entire night digging deeply into the financial architecture of the elite consulting firm owned by Preston. The shiny, polished company was nothing more than a complete and total illusion. Marcus explained that Preston was not actually investing his clients' money into lucrative offshore portfolios like he loudly claimed at expensive dinner parties. He was using the fresh capital from new clients to silently pay off the massive returns he had falsely promised to his older clients. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme built entirely on arrogance and greed, and the entire fraudulent structure was currently collapsing under its own massive, unsustainable weight. The firm was bleeding money and facing imminent federal exposure. But that was not the most terrifying part of the financial report. I slowly turned the page and saw a series of grainy black and white photographs showing Preston secretly meeting with several dangerous-looking men in a dark underground parking garage. The men were heavily tattooed and carrying themselves with the casual, brutal violence of career criminals. I looked up at Marcus with a silent, serious question in my eyes. Marcus took a slow, deliberate sip of his black coffee before delivering the final lethal blow. He explained that when the Ponzi scheme began to rapidly run out of fresh cash, Preston had become incredibly desperate. In a foolish, arrogant attempt to keep his luxurious lifestyle afloat and hide his massive financial fraud from his wealthy, judgmental parents, he had borrowed money from the absolute worst kind of people. Preston had quietly taken a massive high-interest loan from a notoriously violent organized crime syndicate operating deep within the Chicago underworld. This particular ruthless cartel did not rely on expensive lawyers or corrupt courts to collect their massive debts. They relied on extreme physical violence and absolute total terror. I looked back down at the detailed financial documents. The numbers printed on the paper were truly staggering. Preston owed the cartel exactly $12 million. And according to the intercepted encrypted messages Marcus had skillfully uncovered, the ruthless cartel had officially lost their patience with the arrogant rich boy. They were no longer accepting his pathetic excuses or his desperate promises of future payments. They had given Preston a strict, non-negotiable deadline. Marcus leaned closer to me, his dark eyes locking onto mine with absolute chilling certainty. He told me that Preston did not just want my $50 million so he could live comfortably with Maya. He needed my money to literally save his own miserable life. If Preston did not pay the cartel the full $12 million in cash by the absolute end of this month, they were going to brutally murder him in the streets. The poisoned glass of wine at the steakhouse was not just an act of pure corporate greed. It was an act of raw, blind, panicked survival. Preston was a dead man walking, and he was desperately trying to use my corpse as a human shield against the criminal underworld. I closed the heavy manila folder and rested my hands flat against the cold table. The loud, noisy media smear campaign, the treacherous board of directors, and the completely stalled police investigation suddenly seemed entirely irrelevant. The Kensington family thought they were playing a high society game of public relations and legal technicalities. They truly believed they held all the powerful cards because they controlled the evening news and intimidated the local police. But they had absolutely no idea that their precious son had unknowingly dragged their pristine, aristocratic name into a dark, violent world of blood and death. I did not need to publicly defend myself against their pathetic lies anymore. I simply needed to quietly step aside and let the vicious wolves they had invited to their door completely tear them apart. A cold, dark smile slowly formed on my face as I picked up my cup of coffee. The war was just beginning. I sat alone in my study. The heavy manila folder lay open on my oak desk. Marcus warned me there was one more document buried at the very back. I turned the final page. It was a dense legal contract filled with complex financial jargon. I put on my reading glasses. It took me less than 5 minutes to fully understand the absolute depth of his cold-blooded premeditation. 6 months ago, Preston had quietly taken out a massive life insurance policy on my life. It was for exactly $20 million. On paper, the primary beneficiary of the massive policy was my daughter, Maya. It looked like a standard wealth management strategy designed to protect his wife. But when I read the highly obscure secondary clauses, I found the fatal trap. Preston had explicitly structured the policy so that the payout would be deposited directly into a joint trust account, an account over which he held absolute executive control. The poisoned wine at the steakhouse was never just a desperate, impulsive act. It was a meticulously planned execution. If he had successfully killed me that night, he would have immediately inherited the $20 million completely tax-free. It was enough cash to secretly pay off the violent cartel and still maintain his luxurious fake lifestyle. He had priced my entire 71 years of life at exactly $20 million. He had been planning my murder for half a year, secretly measuring me for a coffin. I carefully folded the insurance document and placed it into the breast pocket of my tailored suit. I did not call the lead detective. The corrupt legal system was far too slow and heavily biased in favor of his wealthy family. I needed to look my intended murderer directly in his pale eyes and let him know that the shadows were closing in. I drove my dark sedan out to the most exclusive suburb in the city. The Oakbridge Country Club was a sprawling, immaculate estate surrounded by perfectly manicured green golf courses and high wrought-iron gates. It was a historic private club maintained by generations of deep-rooted prejudice. I parked my car near the grand entrance and walked confidently up the wide marble steps. I wore my best dark charcoal suit and carried myself with the undeniable authority of a man who had conquered the corporate world. The grand dining room was filled with wealthy members eating lunch. When I walked through the tall oak doors, the entire room seemed to suddenly drop in temperature. Conversation slowly ground to a complete halt. Dozens of pale, wealthy faces turned to stare at me with a mixture of profound confusion and subtle hostility. I ignored their judgmental stares completely. I scanned the elegant room until I spotted the man. Preston was sitting at a premium corner table surrounded by 3 other wealthy young men. He was laughing loudly, holding a crystal glass of expensive scotch and celebrating his public victim status. I walked slowly across the dining room floor. The heavy silence followed me every step of the way. When I reached his table, the 3 other men stopped laughing and looked at me with obvious discomfort. Preston looked up and the smug, arrogant smile instantly vanished from his pale face. He gripped his glass of scotch so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. "Vernon," he said, his voice cracking slightly with genuine surprise and sudden fear. "What the hell are you doing here? This is a highly exclusive private club. You cannot just walk in here." I did not raise my voice. I simply stood over him, casting a long, dark shadow across his expensive lunch. I leaned down slightly, resting my hands on the pristine white tablecloth. "You are looking surprisingly well for a man who just survived a sudden massive heart attack, Preston," I said, my voice low and perfectly calm. His wealthy friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats, entirely unsure of how to handle the sudden tense confrontation. Preston quickly recovered his arrogant composure. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms defensively. "I am currently recovering from a severe emotional trauma, Vernon. Something you clearly know absolutely nothing about. You should leave right now before I have the club security forcefully remove you for trespassing." I ignored his pathetic, empty threat. I leaned closer to his face so that only he could hear my next words over the quiet hum of the dining room. "I just had a very interesting morning reading some private financial documents, Preston. I read all about a certain elite consulting firm that is currently bleeding millions of dollars. I read about a desperate young man who owes $12 million to some very unpleasant people from my old side of town." The color completely drained from Preston's face. His pale blue eyes widened in sheer, absolute terror. His confident, arrogant posture instantly collapsed. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was staring at me like he was looking at a living ghost. "You thought you could easily erase me and use my money to save your miserable life," I whispered, staring directly into his terrified soul. "Those violent men you borrowed money from do not care about your country club memberships, Preston. They do not care about your expensive lawyers or your media smear campaigns. They only care about their $12 million, and you are entirely out of time." For a brief, satisfying second, I saw the absolute raw panic completely consume him. He realized that his darkest, most dangerous secret was exposed. But Preston was a man built entirely on false pride and deep delusion. The sheer terror in his eyes quickly morphed back into desperate, defensive arrogance. He let out a forced laugh that sounded incredibly hollow and unconvincing. He looked around at all his confused friends. "You are completely insane," Vernon Preston said, shaking his head with a fake condescending smile. "You are just a paranoid, senile old man making up ridiculous imaginary stories because you are losing your mind. You have absolutely nothing. You are a relic, Vernon, a dinosaur. I have Maya on my side. I have the entire media narrative under my complete control, and soon I will have your entire company and everything you have ever built. You are completely finished." I looked at him with profound pity and absolute disgust. He was a dead man walking who proudly thought he was a king. I did not argue with his pathetic delusions. I simply stood up straight and buttoned my suit jacket. "Enjoy your lunch, Preston," I said softly. "It might be one of the last peaceful meals you ever have." I turned my back on him and walked out of the silent dining room. I could feel the hostile stares of the wealthy club members burning into my back, but I did not care. The trap was perfectly set. Preston knew that I possessed the one piece of information that could completely destroy him. A desperate coward will always make a fatal mistake when he feels the walls finally closing in around him. I walked out the grand front doors of the country club and stepped into the bright afternoon sun. I felt a cold sense of absolute clarity. The war was no longer being fought in the corrupt media or the biased courtrooms. It was now a brutal fight for pure survival. I walked across the manicured parking lot toward where I had parked my dark sedan, but as I approached the vehicle, my calm, steady heart suddenly skipped a beat. The entire front windshield of my expensive car had been violently smashed. The thick safety glass was shattered into 1,000 jagged spiderweb patterns, completely caving in over the steering wheel. I stopped walking and looked around the quiet, empty parking lot. There was absolutely no one around, no witnesses, and no security guards. I stepped cautiously closer to the damaged car. The driver's side window had also been completely shattered. Sharp pieces of broken glass littered the pristine black leather interior. I leaned in slowly to inspect the extensive damage. Sitting perfectly upright in the absolute center of my driver's seat, resting cleanly on the dark leather, was a single heavy brass bullet casing. It was not a random act of vandalism. It was a specific, undeniable message. Preston had panicked. He realized that I was an immediate existential threat to his survival. Instead of confessing or running away, he had chosen to escalate the violence to a terrifying new level. He was actively using the violent cartel to directly intimidate me into dropping the criminal charges and signing over my corporate wealth. He sent the monsters he owed money to straight to my front door. I reached into the car and carefully picked up the cold brass casing. It felt heavy and incredibly dangerous in the palm of my hand. The media and the police thought they were dealing with a simple, tragic family dispute. They had no idea that a massive, violent storm was about to tear this entire city apart. I closed my fist tightly around the casing. Preston completely forgot that the dark, violent streets were exactly where I was forged. The heavy brass doors of the county courthouse felt cold against my palm as I pushed them open. I had received the emergency legal summons less than 24 hours after finding the bullet casing in my ruined car. The wealthy Kensington family had wasted absolutely no time in launching their next aggressive assault. They had formally filed an emergency petition for a permanent restraining order against me. In their heavily fabricated legal documents, they brazenly claimed that I was a violently unstable and severely senile old man who posed a direct physical threat to my own daughter. They were petitioning the stern state judge to legally mandate that Maya sever all physical and emotional ties with me forever. They wanted the full weight of the judicial system to build an impenetrable wall between a father and his only child. It was a vicious, calculated strategy designed to isolate me completely and force me into a desperate emotional surrender. I walked through the busy security checkpoint wearing a simple, understated gray suit. I did not bring a briefcase. I did not bring a team of expensive corporate attorneys to loudly defend my honor. I came completely alone. When I walked into the designated courtroom, the oppressive atmosphere was instantly suffocating. Richard and Catherine Kensington were already sitting proudly in the front row of the wooden gallery directly behind their son. They wore their expensive conservative clothing like tailored armor, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable authority. Preston sat confidently at the petitioner's table, whispering rapidly into the ear of his high-priced defense attorney. And sitting right next to him, looking exhausted and deeply conflicted, was my beautiful daughter Maya. She kept her eyes glued firmly to the scratched wooden table, completely refusing to look in my direction as I slowly walked down the center aisle. She looked like a fragile prisoner of war who had fully accepted her tragic captivity. The Kensingtons had clearly convinced her that my sudden appearance at the country club was the erratic, dangerous behavior of a man rapidly losing his mental faculties. I took my seat alone at the empty defense table. The wealthy lawyer across the aisle looked at my solitary presence and smirked openly. He fully believed he was about to easily slaughter a helpless, undefended old man in the courtroom. The wooden gavel cracked, sharply echoing through the quiet room as the judge called the emergency hearing to order. The judge was an older, stern-looking man with a reputation for zero tolerance. He looked down at me from his high bench with obvious skepticism, clearly wondering why a wealthy corporate executive would show up to an emergency hearing without any legal representation. I kept my posture slightly hunched and my hands trembling just enough to sell the fragile illusion they had created. The shark attorney immediately stood up and launched into a brutal, perfectly rehearsed character assassination. He paced aggressively across the courtroom floor using his loud, booming voice to paint a horrifying fictional picture of my life. He told the judge that I was a deeply paranoid individual who was aggressively hoarding my wealth and threatening the physical safety of my daughter and her loving husband. He dramatically recounted the incident at the upscale steakhouse, completely twisting the facts to claim that I had maliciously poisoned my own glass of wine in a deranged attempt to frame Preston for murder. The lawyer waved his arms and pointed directly at me, calling me a dangerous, unpredictable threat to civilized society. But the arrogant lawyer did not stop at recent fabricated events. He maliciously dug deep into the distant past to completely destroy my character. He pulled out a yellowed piece of paper from his thick leather briefcase and presented it dramatically to the judge. It was a minor police arrest record from more than 40 years ago. When I was a young, desperate man fighting to survive on the brutal streets of the city, I had been briefly detained by the police for getting into a physical altercation while actively protecting a young neighborhood boy from a violent street gang. The ancient charges had been completely dropped the very next morning, and my record had been expunged for decades. But the expensive lawyer twisted that ancient noble memory into something dark and highly sinister. He looked at the judge and loudly proclaimed that underneath my expensive corporate suits, I was still just a violent street thug who solved his personal problems with raw physical aggression. He claimed that my advanced old age had simply stripped away my civilized corporate mask and revealed the dangerous criminal that had always been hiding underneath. He told the court that I had violently threatened Preston at a private country club just yesterday, proving that my aggressive ghetto mentality was a severe danger to his innocent, wealthy clients. I sat completely silent and motionless at the defense table. I did not object to his outrageous lies. I did not jump up and angrily scream that he was manipulating the truth. I simply stared blankly ahead, playing the perfect role of a confused, exhausted old man who was completely overwhelmed by the complex legal proceedings. My strategic silence only fueled their blinding arrogance. The lawyer then called Preston to the wooden witness stand. Preston placed his hand on the Holy Bible and boldly swore to tell the absolute truth. And then he sat there and smoothly lied through his perfect white teeth. He testified under oath that I had physically assaulted him at the restaurant. He testified that I had been sending him threatening, psychotic text messages for months. Catherine and Richard sat in the gallery nodding their heads in solemn agreement, silently supporting the massive web of perjury. They were eagerly building a colossal house of lies on the permanent official court record. They were fully committing federal perjury right in front of a sitting judge, believing their wealth and status made them completely invincible to the consequences of their reckless actions. I patiently let them speak for nearly an hour. I let them exhaust all their fictional stories and dramatic emotional pleas. I let Maya listen to every single word of their polished, rehearsed lies. I knew that the higher they built their arrogant tower of deception, the more devastating the absolute destruction would be when I finally pulled the foundation out from under them. The lawyer eventually finished his aggressive grandstanding and confidently returned to his seat. He shot me a highly arrogant look of absolute victory. He truly believed he had successfully convinced the judge to issue the permanent restraining order and strip away my parental rights forever. The courtroom fell into a heavy, tense silence, waiting for the final devastating blow to fall upon my shoulders. The stern judge looked down at me from his high wooden bench. His expression was a mixture of pity and professional irritation. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said, his deep voice echoing loudly in the quiet room, "you have chosen to appear in my courtroom today without any legal counsel to represent your specific interests. You have just heard a very serious and highly disturbing series of allegations made against your personal character and your mental stability. The petitioners have formally requested a permanent judicial order that would legally mandate your complete separation from your daughter and her husband. Do you have absolutely anything to say in your own defense before I make my final legal ruling on this emergency matter today?" I slowly stood up from my wooden chair. I deliberately took my time, leaning heavily on the defense table as if my old, tired legs could barely support my physical weight. I kept my head slightly bowed, completely maintaining the pathetic illusion of a defeated, broken man. I did not speak right away. I slowly reached into the inside pocket of my gray suit jacket. The expensive lawyer immediately tensed up, practically jumping out of his chair. "Objection, Your Honor!" the lawyer shouted nervously, clearly afraid of what I might suddenly say. "The respondent is highly unstable. He should not be allowed to address the court without proper legal supervision." The judge firmly raised his hand, completely silencing the panicked lawyer. "I will allow Mr. Caldwell to speak," the judge commanded. "Proceed, sir." I took a slow, deep breath and looked directly up at the judge. All the fake confusion and fabricated weakness instantly vanished from my face. My posture straightened into the rigid, commanding stance of a corporate titan who had successfully crushed billionaires in the ruthless boardroom. I did not offer a long, emotional defense. I did not beg the judge for mercy or loudly accuse the Kensingtons of lying. I simply walked slowly and confidently up to the tall wooden bench. "I am fully aware of the severe allegations presented today. Your Honor," I said, my voice completely steady and radiating absolute freezing authority. "And I have absolutely no desire to waste the valuable time of this honorable court arguing against completely fabricated fairy tales. However, I believe you will find this specific piece of documented evidence highly relevant to the basic integrity of these entire legal proceedings." I smoothly handed a single crisp white document directly to the court bailiff, who immediately passed it up to the waiting judge. It was not a medical record proving my sanity. It was not a character reference from my corporate board. It was a highly classified financial ledger that Marcus, the brilliant forensic accountant, had pulled from the deepest, darkest corners of the criminal underground. It was a direct banking transfer record, perfectly proving that the aggressive, high-priced lawyer sitting confidently at the petitioner's table was actually receiving massive monthly retainer payments from the exact same violent cartel that Preston currently owed $12 million to. The lawyer was not just a legal representative for the wealthy Kensington family. He was a highly paid covert operative for the ruthless organized crime syndicate directly embedded into this civil case to legally strong-arm me into surrendering my $50 million fortune to pay off Preston's massive criminal debt. The entire courtroom held its collective breath in absolute silence. I stood perfectly still, watching the judge carefully read the single piece of paper. Maya looked up from the table, sensing the sudden, terrifying shift in the atmosphere. The stern judge read the first few lines, and his eyes suddenly widened in profound shock. He read further down the page, and the natural color began to completely drain from his face. His judicial hands actually started to physically tremble, holding the damning document. He looked up from the paper, staring directly at the arrogant defense lawyer with a look of pure, unadulterated horror and deep professional disgust. The trap had been flawlessly executed, and the predator was officially caught. The sprawling Kensington estate was supposed to be a safe sanctuary, but it quickly transformed into a cold, suffocating prison. Maya spent her first 3 days hiding behind the high stone walls of the mansion, completely isolated from the outside world. Catherine and Richard confiscated her car keys under the gentle guise of keeping her safe from aggressive reporters. They insisted that she needed absolute rest to recover from the severe emotional trauma of the restaurant incident. At first, Maya genuinely believed they were simply being fiercely protective and deeply loving parents. She spent hours crying in the guest bedroom praying for her husband. But as the long days dragged into restless nights, the perfect aristocratic illusion began to violently crack. Preston was not acting like a traumatized victim who had barely survived a sudden heart attack. He was acting like a highly dangerous cornered animal. The charming, confident man she had married was entirely gone. He paced the hardwood corridors at all hours of the night, muttering angrily to himself. He began drinking heavily, pouring massive glasses of scotch before the sun even fully rose. He snapped viciously at the household staff and threw expensive glasses against the wall whenever the news mentioned my stock stabilizing. The most terrifying change was the secret late-night phone calls. Maya would often wake up at 3 in the morning to find the bed completely empty. She would tiptoe out into the dark hallway and hear Preston arguing in a frantic, desperate whisper down in the grand study. He was not using his regular smartphone. He was using a cheap, black plastic burner phone. Whenever Maya asked who he was speaking to, he would instantly turn cold and highly aggressive. He would yell at her, demanding she stop acting like a paranoid lunatic and go back to sleep. He blamed his extreme volatility on the severe stress of my supposed legal attacks. Maya desperately tried to force herself to believe his pathetic excuses. She clung blindly to the beautiful fictional reality he built for her because the terrifying alternative was simply too massive and painful to accept. But the dark seeds of deep doubt had already been firmly planted in her mind. My calm face at the hospital kept flashing behind her closed eyes. My absolute refusal to argue with her baseless accusations haunted her quiet moments. The breaking point finally arrived on a stormy Thursday morning. Heavy rain lashed violently against the tall glass windows of the estate. Preston had been awake all night, drinking heavily and sweating profusely. Around 10 in the morning, he finally stumbled into the master bathroom and turned on the hot shower. The heavy oak door clicked shut, and the loud sound of rushing water echoed through the bedroom. Maya sat alone on the edge of the large canopy bed, staring blankly at the floor. Suddenly, a harsh buzzing sound broke the tension in the room. It was not coming from the polished wooden nightstand where Preston kept his regular phone. The buzzing was coming directly from the pocket of his discarded suit jacket lying carelessly across the armchair. Maya's heart immediately began to pound violently against her ribs. She knew she should simply ignore it. She knew that looking through his private belongings was a massive violation of trust. But the agonizing weight of the unknown was completely crushing her soul. Her trembling hands reached out slowly and pulled the cheap black burner phone from the dark silk pocket. The bright digital screen was glowing with a new incoming text message. The phone did not have a security passcode. Preston was far too arrogant to believe his obedient, naive wife would ever dare to spy on him. Maya swiped the screen and opened the text conversation. The contact name was simply saved as a single capital letter C. Maya began to read the long history of hidden messages. Her blood instantly turned to freezing ice. The messages were not from a concerned friend or a stressed business partner. They were from his mother, Catherine. Maya read the calculated words, completely unable to breathe. The recent message from Catherine was brutally direct. It read, "You need to handle those people, Preston. We cannot afford another mistake like the failed dosage at the steakhouse." Maya felt the entire room violently spin around her. The failed dosage. The words burned into her retinas like hot branding iron. She frantically scrolled up in the chat history, praying it was just a terrible misunderstanding. But the horrible truth only grew darker and more undeniable with every single line of text. A message from Preston sent exactly 1 week before the dinner read, "The $20 million life insurance policy is fully secured and locked. Maya inherits immediately. I control the joint accounts." A response from Catherine read, "Just make sure the old man actually drinks it this time. Do not let your nerves ruin our entire family." The black plastic phone slipped from her trembling fingers and fell onto the thick Persian rug. Maya clapped both hands tightly over her mouth to stop herself from screaming out loud. The massive, beautiful walls of her entire reality completely shattered into a million jagged, agonizing pieces. Everything I had warned her about was absolutely true. Her handsome, charming husband was a cold-blooded, calculating murderer. He had never actually loved her. He had only seen her as a highly convenient financial stepping stone to reach my corporate fortune. The sudden horrific heart attack at the restaurant was not a tragic medical mystery. Preston had accidentally poisoned himself while actively trying to murder her own father. and his elegant aristocratic mother was fully complicit in the entire terrifying assassination plot. Maya felt a sudden violent wave of physical nausea wash over her. She stumbled away from the velvet armchair, gasping desperately for clean air. The profound, crushing guilt of her own blindness hit her like a speeding freight train. She had viciously screamed at me in the hospital corridor. She had accused me of being a paranoid racist monster while I sat there completely silently absorbing her hateful words to protect her. I had known the absolute truth the entire time, and I was quietly fighting a massive, brutal war simply to keep her alive. She wiped the hot, angry tears from her face. The paralyzing shock quickly mutated into a pure, desperate adrenaline. She knew with absolute chilling certainty that she could not stay in this house for another single second. If Preston and Catherine were completely willing to murder her powerful father, they would absolutely not hesitate to silence her if they realized she knew their deadly secret. Maya quietly grabbed a small leather duffel bag from the master closet. She did not pack any of the expensive designer clothes or heavy diamond jewelry they had bought for her. She only packed her basic personal identification, her credit cards, and a pair of comfortable walking shoes. She zipped the bag shut with trembling hands, keeping her frightened eyes locked firmly on the closed bathroom door. The loud shower was still running. She had exactly 2 minutes to completely disappear before he stepped out. Maya slipped quietly out of the master bedroom and crept silently down the grand curved staircase. The massive, silent mansion felt like a dark, terrifying tomb. She reached the enormous marble foyer. The heavy wooden front doors were only 20 feet away. Freedom and absolute truth were waiting just on the other side of that polished brass handle. She walked quickly across the cold marble floor, her heart hammering frantically in her throat. She reached her hand out and tightly gripped the cold brass handle. She turned it firmly, but the heavy door did not open. It was completely locked from the inside with a heavy digital security deadbolt. Before her panicked mind could even register the severe problem, a sharp, elegant voice cut through the quiet shadows of the foyer. Leaving so soon, Maya. Maya spun around completely terrified. Catherine Kensington stepped smoothly out of the dark adjacent parlor room. She was wearing a pristine white cashmere sweater and holding a delicate porcelain teacup. The sweet, loving maternal mask she had worn at the hospital was entirely gone. Her pale blue eyes were cold dead and filled with absolute terrifying malice. Maya backed away slowly, pressing her trembling shoulders tightly against the locked wooden door. "Please let me leave," Maya whispered, her voice shaking violently. "I know absolutely everything, Catherine. I saw the text messages on the burner phone." Catherine did not look surprised or panicked. She simply took a slow, elegant sip of her hot tea and smiled a horrible, chilling smile. She walked slowly toward the security keypad mounted on the wall and completely turned off the digital screen. "You are not going anywhere, sweetie," Catherine said, her voice dripping with pure, refined venom. "Until your father signs over the company, you are our guest." I returned to my quiet apartment after the dramatic courtroom hearing. I poured myself a small glass of cold water and stood by the large window looking out over the sprawling city skyline. I had successfully exposed their corrupt defense attorney and completely humiliated them in front of the stern judge. The legal trap had worked perfectly, and I had secured a major tactical victory. But my profound sense of accomplishment was incredibly short-lived. My mobile phone suddenly vibrated loudly on the smooth marble kitchen counter. The digital caller identification simply displayed a blocked number, but I instinctively knew exactly who was waiting on the other end of the line. I answered the call and brought the phone slowly to my ear without saying a single word. It was Richard Kensington. The polished, aristocratic tone he usually projected to the world was completely gone. His voice was ragged, heavy, and vibrating with pure malicious desperation. The polite mask of high society had finally slipped off his face completely, revealing the absolute terrifying monster hiding underneath. He did not bother with fake pleasantries or highly coded racist insults. He got straight to the terrifying point of his sudden call. He confidently told me that my beautiful daughter Maya had unfortunately discovered some highly sensitive private information on a burner phone earlier that morning. He said she had completely lost her fragile mind and attempted to violently flee the massive estate in a state of severe paranoid delusion. My heart instantly stopped beating in my chest. I asked him directly where my daughter was and what terrible things they had done to her. Richard let out a cold, cruel laugh that made my blood run entirely freezing cold. He confidently informed me that Maya was currently locked safely inside their heavy guest bedroom. She was heavily sedated and under their strict continuous supervision. He proudly reminded me that Preston was still her legal husband. Under the current state medical laws, Preston held absolute executive medical power of attorney over her entire physical and mental well-being. Richard stated that because Maya was acting so violently erratic, Preston had already signed the preliminary medical paperwork to have her permanently transferred to a private psychiatric facility located outside the state. Richard described the remote facility as a highly secure institution where wealthy families sent their problematic relatives to be kept heavily medicated and completely silenced for the rest of their natural lives. He promised me that if she walked through those heavy iron doors, I would never ever see my daughter again. She would become a permanent medical prisoner trapped inside her own heavily drugged mind until the day she finally died. The profound extortion was completely brutal and completely undeniable. Richard laid out his absolute final terms with chilling clarity. He demanded that I immediately sign over my entire $50 million logistics company directly into Preston Holding Firm. He also demanded that I completely drop all pending criminal police charges against his son and publicly confess to the local media that my accusations were the tragic result of my own failing mental health. If I completely surrendered my entire corporate fortune and my professional legacy by midnight tonight, they would generously allow Maya to return home to me safely. If I refused to comply with every single demand, or if I foolishly attempted to involve the local police authorities, Preston would instantly execute the final medical transfer. Maya would vanish into the dark private asylum before the sun even rose tomorrow morning. Richard told me to gather the official corporate transfer documents and bring them personally to the Kensington estate tonight. He warned me to come entirely alone. He abruptly ended the phone call, leaving me listening to the dead, empty silence of the cellular network. I lowered the mobile phone from my ear and placed it gently on the kitchen counter. A weaker man would have completely panicked and dialed the emergency police dispatch number immediately. A desperate man would have rushed blindly to the heavily fortified mansion, screaming and demanding the safe return of his only child. But I am an incredibly disciplined survivor. I felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of cold, absolute fury wash over my entire body. It was a dark, primal anger that I had carefully buried deep inside my soul for more than 40 years. The wealthy Kensington family had made a fatal miscalculation. They truly believed that because I wore expensive tailored suits and sat in elegant corporate boardrooms, I had somehow forgotten how to fight in the brutal, terrifying dark. They thought they were holding all the powerful cards because they knew how to successfully manipulate the complex legal system. They did not realize that by physically threatening my innocent daughter, they had completely removed all the civilized rules of engagement. I absolutely knew that I could not call the local police department. The legal justice system was far too slow, incredibly bureaucratic, and easily manipulated by wealthy families like the Kensingtons. If a fleet of loud police cruisers suddenly arrived at the massive iron gates of their sprawling estate, Richard would simply instruct his expensive lawyers to stall the officers at the front door. Meanwhile, Preston would use his legal medical authority to aggressively sedate Maya even further and have her quietly smuggled out through a hidden service entrance in a private ambulance. I did not have the luxury of waiting for search warrants or arguing with skeptical detectives who were already heavily biased against me. I needed a completely different kind of overwhelming force. I needed individuals who operated entirely outside the corrupt boundaries of the formal legal system. I needed men who understood the language of sudden absolute violence and total tactical surprise. I picked up my phone again and dialed a specific number I had saved deeply in my private contacts. The phone rang only once before the young man answered. It was Trey, the courageous African-American waiter from the high-end steakhouse who had bravely warned me about the poisoned wine. Trey was currently studying architectural design, but I knew his complex background very well. I had personally run a deep background check on him after he saved my life that night. Trey grew up in the exact same rough housing projects on the south side of Chicago where I had spent my violent youth. Despite his polite professional demeanor at the restaurant, Trey still maintained very deep and highly respected ties to the underground street networks in his old neighborhood. His older brother was a highly influential figure in a sophisticated underground security organization that provided highly discreet, non-lethal tactical muscle for people who could not afford to involve the official authorities. Trey answered the phone with a polite professional greeting, but I immediately cut him off. I did not use my standard calm corporate voice. I spoke to him using the harsh, direct rhythm of the brutal streets we both originally came from. I told him exactly what the wealthy family was actively doing to my innocent daughter. I explained the terrifying medical extortion and the absolute strict deadline I was currently facing. I did not ask him for a small personal favor. I completely demanded his immediate operational assistance. I told him that I needed a highly skilled tactical crew. I needed 5 extremely capable men who knew exactly how to silently breach a heavily fortified residential compound, bypass complex digital security alarms, and rapidly secure a physical hostage without firing a single lethal gunshot. I promised to pay him and his crew an absolute fortune in untraceable cash by tomorrow morning. I just needed them ready to move in exactly 1 hour. Trey did not hesitate or ask any cowardly questions. He completely understood the severe gravity of the violent situation. He simply told me to text him the exact physical address of the Kensington estate and promised that his brother highly trained team would be fully prepped and waiting for my signal in the dark shadows outside the perimeter walls. He ended the call with a firm tone of absolute loyalty. I placed the phone securely into my pocket and walked slowly toward my master bedroom. The time for peaceful corporate negotiation and clever legal maneuvering was completely over. The wealthy Kensington family wanted to drag me into a brutal physical war to steal my massive fortune. I was fully prepared to grant their arrogant wish. I walked directly into my massive walk-in closet and completely bypassed the long row of expensive Italian silk suits. Hanging alone in the dark back corner was an incredibly old, worn black leather trench coat. It was the exact heavy coat I wore 40 years ago, fighting for my survival on the freezing streets. I slid my arms into the familiar dark sleeves, feeling a cold sense of righteous confidence. I was heading to the Kensington estate tonight, but I was not going alone. The heavy wrought iron gates of the Kensington estate loomed in the dark, misty rain. I parked my dark sedan at the end of the long, winding driveway. I stepped out into the cold night wearing my old black leather trench coat. The massive mansion stood before me like a fortress of arrogance and stolen wealth. Bright security lights illuminated the pristine manicured lawns, but the inside of the house felt like a dark, terrifying tomb. I walked slowly up the wide stone steps and pushed open the heavy oak front door. The massive foyer was entirely silent and empty. I did not bother to knock or announce my arrival. I walked with the heavy, deliberate steps of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The thick Persian rugs muffled the sound of my heavy leather boots. I moved down the long, dimly lit corridor toward the grand study. The heavy mahogany doors were slightly open, spilling a thin slice of warm yellow light into the dark hallway. I pushed the doors open completely and stepped inside the room. The oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of the grand study immediately hit my old face like a solid, physical brick wall. Richard and Catherine Kensington were sitting comfortably in matching leather armchairs by the roaring stone fireplace. They were sipping expensive brandy and looking entirely too relaxed for people who were actively holding a woman hostage. Preston was standing nervously behind the massive mahogany desk, and then my eyes found my beautiful daughter. Maya was sitting curled up in a dark corner of the room. She was sitting on a hard wooden chair with her knees pulled tightly to her chest. She looked absolutely terrified. Her beautiful, expensive clothes were torn, and her dark hair was a highly messy, unkempt tangle. But it was the dark purple bruise on her right cheek that made my blood run completely freezing cold. Someone had violently struck my daughter. The primal, violent rage I had buried deep inside my soul screamed to be released. I wanted to tear the room apart and beat the wealthy men to a bloody pulp, but I forced myself to remain perfectly still and completely emotionless. A reckless, angry man makes fatal tactical mistakes. A cold, calculating survivor executes his enemies flawlessly. I kept my hands resting calmly at my sides and looked directly at Richard Kensington's arrogant face. "Right on time," Vernon Richards said with a thick, arrogant smirk. He did not even bother to stand up from his comfortable leather armchair. He simply swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass and looked at me like I was a highly obedient dog. "I told you to bring the corporate transfer documents, and you followed my strict orders perfectly." Catherine smiled her cold, dead smile and took a delicate sip of her own drink. Maya looked up at me with tear-filled eyes. "Dad, please just do what they want," Maya whispered softly, her weak voice shaking violently. I ignored my daughter's desperate plea and kept my eyes locked firmly on Richard. I walked slowly toward the massive mahogany desk. Preston nervously pushed a thick stack of legal documents across the polished wooden surface. He placed an expensive gold fountain pen right next to the papers. Sign the bottom of every single page, Vernon Preston commanded. His voice was loud, but his hands were shaking uncontrollably. You sign over your entire $50 million company to my holding firm right now, and we will let your crazy daughter walk safely out of the large front door, completely unharmed. I did not immediately reach for the expensive gold pen. I slowly picked up the thick stack of legal documents and began to read the complex financial clauses. What are you doing? Richard snapped angrily, sitting up straight in his leather chair. You do not need to read the contract, Vernon. You have absolutely no negotiating power in this room. You are completely out of options. Sign the damn papers and leave our house before I completely lose my absolute remaining patience. I ignored his loud, arrogant barking and calmly turned to the second page of the complex legal contract. I adjusted my glasses and read the text out loud. It says here that my highly profitable logistics company will be fully absorbed by the Kensington Global Consulting Group. I looked up from the paper and stared directly into Preston's pale, sweating face. That is a highly interesting corporate strategy, Preston, especially considering the absolute undeniable fact that your global consulting group is completely bankrupt. The entire room suddenly went completely silent. The smug, arrogant smile instantly vanished from Richard's face. Catherine slowly lowered her heavy crystal glass to the shiny table, her eyes widening in pure sudden, sheer panic. What the hell are you talking about? Richard demanded, his aristocratic voice cracking with sudden fear. Our ancient family company is completely rock solid. I slowly shook my head and tossed the thick legal documents back onto the mahogany desk. You are all completely broke, I stated, my voice radiating absolute freezing authority. Your precious son has been running a massive illegal Ponzi scheme for years. He has lost millions of dollars of client money. Your entire family fortune is built on a pathetic, fragile lie, and now the terrible truth has finally come to collect its massive, bloody debt. Preston's sweaty face turned the color of dirty chalk. He looked desperately at his terrified parents, completely unable to deny the harsh, absolute truth. I know about the $12 million you owe to the cartel, Preston, I said, taking one slow, deliberate step closer to the desk. I know they gave you a strict deadline. You did not want my company to build a better future. You desperately wanted my money to stop those violent men from murdering you in the street. You thought you could use my innocent daughter as a human shield to save your miserable life. Richard stood up from his leather armchair, his hands trembling with absolute horrific realization. He looked at his son with pure, profound disgust. You borrowed money from a violent street cartel, Richard whispered, his voice thick with sheer horror. You put our entire aristocratic family in extreme physical danger to cover up your own pathetic financial failures. Catherine buried her face in her hands and began to sob loudly. The beautiful, flawless illusion of the wealthy Kensington family was completely shattering into a million pieces right in front of my eyes. They were completely destroying their own pathetic lives forever. But Preston was always far too desperate and far too cowardly to accept his massive defeat. He let out a loud, hysterical laugh that sounded entirely psychotic. He reached quickly into the top drawer of the heavy mahogany desk. When he pulled his hand out, he was holding a heavy black steel handgun. He raised the dark weapon and pointed the metal barrel directly at my chest. Maya screamed violently and covered her head with her arms. Richard shouted at his son to put the weapon down, but Preston was completely out of his fragile mind with pure, absolute terror. "Sign the papers, Vernon!" Preston screamed, his voice echoing wildly in the grand study. The heavy gun was shaking violently in his trembling hands. Sweat was pouring down his pale face, soaking the collar of his expensive silk shirt. "You sign the papers right now, or I swear to God I will shoot you right here and claim self-defense. I will tell the local police you broke into our house and violently attacked my family. They will completely believe me. They always believe people like us over people like you. Pick up the damn pen and just sign it." I looked down the dark barrel of the loaded handgun. I had faced dangerous, violent men my entire life, I had stared down ruthless criminals on the freezing streets of the South Side when Preston was still safely playing in his expensive childhood nursery. A terrified coward holding a gun is incredibly dangerous, but he is also highly predictable. I did not raise my hands in surrender. I did not beg for my life or scream for help. I stood perfectly still, my posture rigid, and my face completely devoid of any fear. I very slowly raised my left wrist. I calmly looked down at the face of my simple silver watch. The second hand was ticking steadily toward the top of the hour. It was exactly midnight. I lowered my arm and looked directly into Preston's wild, panicked eyes. I felt absolutely no pity for the pathetic monster standing before me. "You are completely out of time, Preston," I whispered, my voice dropping as cold and hard as a tombstone. Before he could fully process my terrifying words, the bright crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling instantly died. The entire massive mansion suddenly plunged into pitch-black, utter darkness. The heavy, absolute darkness swallowed the grand study instantly. It was the precise tactical signal I had coordinated with Trey. A deafening silence hung in the pitch-black room for exactly 2 seconds before the pure chaos erupted. The heavy mahogany doors of the study burst open with a violent, explosive force. Heavy, disciplined footsteps flooded into the room from the dark hallway. Bright, blinding tactical flashlights instantly cut through the blackness, pinning Preston like a terrified rat in a trap. He blindly raised the heavy steel handgun, but he was entirely too slow and far too weak. A massive figure stepped smoothly out of the blind spot and delivered a swift, brutal strike to Preston's right wrist. The loud crack of bone was immediately followed by the heavy thud of the loaded gun hitting the thick Persian rug. Preston collapsed to his knees, screaming in absolute physical agony, clutching his shattered wrist. The bright beams of light revealed my tactical crew. They were not expensive private military contractors. 2 of the massive construction workers aggressively grabbed Richard and Catherine, forcing the wealthy, arrogant couple roughly back into their expensive leather armchairs. They did not use lethal weapons, but their sheer physical presence and raw, intimidating power were more than enough to completely paralyze the Kensingtons with sheer terror. I walked calmly through the chaotic scene directly toward my daughter. Maya was trembling violently in the dark corner. But when she saw my calm, steady face walking through the blinding tactical lights, her tears of pure terror instantly turned into tears of profound relief. I reached down and pulled her up from the hard wooden chair. I wrapped my arms tightly around her shoulders, pulling her into a fierce, protective embrace. I looked closely at the dark purple bruise on her beautiful cheek, and a cold, lethal promise settled deep into my bones. "You are completely safe now, Maya," I whispered softly into her ear. "Nobody is ever going to hurt you again." I turned slowly away from my daughter and walked back toward the center of the grand study. The tactical flashlights cast long, terrifying shadows across the expensive room. Preston was currently sobbing pathetically on the floor, completely stripped of his arrogant superiority. Richard and Catherine sat frozen in their leather chairs, staring at my crew of massive, dark-skinned men with a mixture of absolute horror and deeply ingrained prejudice. I looked down at Preston, writhing on the rug. "Pick him up," I commanded. 2 of my men reached down and violently hoisted the crying man to his feet, slamming him roughly against the heavy mahogany desk. I picked up the loaded handgun from the floor and calmly removed the ammunition magazine. I tossed the empty, heavy steel weapon onto the desk next to the fraudulent corporate transfer documents. "You thought you were incredibly ruthless, Preston," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the dark room. "But you are just a desperate amateur playing a highly dangerous game you do not even slightly understand. You pointed a loaded gun at my chest tonight. You fully intended to murder me. Under normal circumstances, I would simply hand this weapon over to the local police and let you rot in a federal prison cell for the rest of your pathetic life." Catherine let out a sudden, desperate gasp of hope. "Please, Vernon," she begged, crying hysterically. "Please, just call the police. We will confess to absolutely everything. We will completely surrender. Just do not let these violent thugs hurt my son." I looked at her tear-stained face with absolute disgust. "You do not get to call the police to save yourselves from the terrible consequences of your own greed, Catherine," I stated coldly. "The formal justice system is far too gentle for monsters like you." I leaned incredibly close to Preston's sweaty, terrified face. "The police are absolutely not coming tonight, Preston," I whispered, my voice dropping to a terrifying, dead monotone. Because the police are not the ones currently waiting for you outside those high iron gates. Preston's eyes widened in pure, absolute panic. What are you talking about? He choked out, his chest heaving violently. I looked at him with a cold, dead stare. I told you I knew exactly who you owed that $12 million to Preston. You missed their strict final deadline. When my men cut the power to your massive estate, we did not just bypass your digital security cameras. We also opened the main front gates completely wide open. Right now, there are 3 black sport utility vehicles idling quietly at the bottom of your long driveway. The men sitting inside those vehicles do not care about your wealthy family name. They are the cartel enforcers, and they are currently waiting for me to walk out of this house so they can walk in and butcher every single one of you. The profound psychological terror completely destroyed whatever tiny shred of fake courage Preston had left inside his soul. He collapsed back onto the polished desk, weeping uncontrollably and violently begging for his miserable life. Richard buried his face in his hands, completely broken by the sheer magnitude of his massive failure. The brutal cartel was not actually waiting outside the gates. It was a brilliant, calculated bluff. But Preston was far too guilty and entirely too terrified to ever question the terrifying logic. "Please, Vernon," Preston screamed, grabbing blindly at my leather coat. "I will do anything you want. I will sign a full confession. I will completely disappear. Please do not let those monsters inside the house." I forcibly swatted his hand away from my coat. "I am not going to let them kill you tonight, Preston," I said slowly. "Because your pathetic death does not benefit my corporate empire in any way. I am going to completely save your miserable life, but you are going to pay me a price so incredibly high it will make you deeply wish you were dead." I walked back around the desk and looked down at the corporate transfer documents. "I am going to sign these exact papers," I announced. The entire room went completely silent in sheer shock. Maya looked at me with profound confusion. "Dad, no," she protested, stepping forward. "They are trying to steal your entire life work." I raised my hand to gently silence her. "I will sign the formal transfer. Preston," I continued. "Tomorrow morning we will officially proceed with your highly anticipated corporate board meeting. We will gather all the wealthy buyers and your elite partners in my downtown skyscraper. You will publicly receive the legal rights to my entire $50 million holding company." Preston looked at me with complete, utter bewilderment. "Why would you do that?" he stammered, his voice weak and pathetic. "Because it is the only way to officially transfer the massive cartel debt away from my family." I lied smoothly, looking directly into his terrified soul. "The cartel wants a legitimate business owner to bleed dry. Once you officially own my massive logistics empire, they will give you a strict payment plan instead of a bloody execution. You are going to spend the rest of your miserable adult life working every single day just to secretly pay off those violent men. You will be nothing more than a highly educated corporate slave working entirely for the criminal underworld. And you will smile and pretend you are a massive success while they slowly drain every single penny from your aristocratic family." Richard looked up from his hands, his aristocratic face completely pale and completely defeated. He finally understood the absolute devastating reality of my brutal terms. I was not just taking my company back. I was forcing them to legally absorb a massive lethal trap in front of the entire corporate world. But for this brilliant illusion to work perfectly, we need to maintain the pristine public narrative I instructed coldly. "Maya is going to stay here in this house with you tonight. She is going to play the role of the dutiful, loving wife for exactly 2 more days. If any of you try to harm her or attempt to run away, I will personally call the cartel and give them your exact location." Maya walked bravely across the room and stood proudly right beside me. The terrified victim was completely gone. She looked at Preston and Catherine with eyes full of cold, absolute determination. "I am fully ready, Dad," she said, her voice completely steady and strong. Maya wrapped her arms around my neck and hugged me tightly, completely committed to destroying her evil in-laws from the inside out. I hugged her back, feeling a deep sense of immense pride. I released my daughter and walked slowly over to Richard Kensington. He was trembling violently in his expensive leather chair, a totally broken, pathetic old man. I leaned down close to his ear and whispered the absolute final truth. "You deeply wanted my world, Richard." I whispered, my voice colder than a freezing winter grave. "Now you are going to completely step into it, and it is going to eat you alive." The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my massive downtown corporate boardroom. From 50 stories up, the entire city of Chicago looked like a small, harmless model. The long, heavy mahogany conference table dominated the center of the pristine room. It was polished to a flawless mirror shine reflecting the cold, modern lighting above. Today was the day the massive $50 million acquisition was supposed to be completely finalized. But the dynamic of the room had fundamentally shifted overnight. I sat quietly at the far end of the long table wearing my sharpest tailored charcoal suit. Directly across from me sat the wealthy Kensington family. They had completely recovered from their pathetic, terrifying display of cowardice the previous night. The bright morning light and the highly secure environment of my corporate skyscraper had artificially restored their deeply ingrained aristocratic arrogance. Richard Kensington wore a custom-tailored navy pinstripe suit sitting perfectly upright with his chest puffed out like a proud, conquering general. Catherine sat gracefully beside him wearing an expensive designer dress and a string of flawless white pearls, completely ignoring my physical presence in the room. They truly believed they had successfully forced me into a total, humiliating submission. They thought my quiet demeanor was the pathetic look of a completely defeated old man who had surrendered his entire life legacy to protect his daughter. Preston sat proudly at the absolute head of the conference table, completely usurping my rightful physical place. He was wearing an incredibly loud light gray suit and a highly expensive silk tie that screamed of unearned corporate superiority. His right wrist was heavily wrapped in a thick white medical bandage from the brutal tactical strike he received last night, but he cleverly hid it beneath the mahogany table. He was smiling a broad, smug smile that made my blood boil beneath my calm exterior. He truly believed he was the brilliant mastermind of the century. He thought his vicious, desperate extortion had worked perfectly. Maya sat quietly next to him. She was wearing a simple dark dress and keeping her beautiful eyes firmly focused on her pristine leather portfolio. She was playing her required role absolutely perfectly. She looked exactly like the terrified, obedient wife they expected her to be. But every few minutes she would briefly glance up and meet my eyes across the long table. In those tiny fraction of seconds, I saw the fierce, burning determination of a strong woman who was fully prepared to watch her vicious abusers burn to the ground. She knew exactly what I was about to do to them. At precisely 10 in the morning, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. The elite team of corporate buyers and their high-priced legal representatives confidently walked into the room. They were highly serious professionals who only cared about securing the massive $50 million logistics network I had built. They looked slightly confused to see Preston sitting eagerly at the head of the table instead of me. I immediately stood up and addressed the wealthy buyers before they could ask any difficult questions. I spoke in a calm, measured tone, explaining that I had made a sudden, permanent decision regarding the absolute future of my legacy. I formally announced that my entire holding company and all its highly profitable assets were being immediately transferred into the elite consulting firm owned by my son-in-law Preston. The lead buyer raised a skeptical eyebrow, but he did not openly object. In the ruthless corporate world, massive restructuring happens constantly, and as long as the legal paperwork was completely ironclad, they had absolutely no reason to halt the massive financial transaction. The elite corporate lawyers opened their thick leather briefcases and began distributing massive stacks of highly complex legal documents across the polished mahogany table. The room was filled with the quiet rustling of heavy paper and the soft murmurs of legal jargon. Preston leaned forward eagerly, pulling the massive stacks of paper directly toward his chest. He picked up an expensive heavy gold fountain pen with his uninjured left hand. His pale blue eyes were practically glowing with raw, unrestrained greed. He did not bother to read a single line of the dense legal text. He was far too arrogant and far too desperate to secure the massive fortune before I could somehow magically change my mind. Richard leaned over and whispered something proudly into his son's ear, patting him heavily on the shoulder. Catherine smiled warmly at the buyers, projecting the absolute picture of a happy, wealthy, united family. Preston began to sign his name rapidly across the bottom of every single page. The scratching sound of his gold pen echoing loudly in the quiet boardroom was the most beautiful music I had ever heard in my entire life. With every single signature, Preston was legally absorbing my massive corporate umbrella into his own failing holding company. He was aggressively taking legal ownership of my nationwide delivery fleets, my massive storage warehouses, and my highly lucrative international shipping contracts. He signed page after page, completely blinded by the blinding illusion of the $50 million payout. He truly believed he had completely outsmarted a seasoned corporate veteran. He thought his vicious, street-level extortion had successfully conquered my 4 decades of ruthless boardroom experience. It took him exactly 15 minutes to sign the entire mountain of complex legal documents. When he finally reached the very last page, he pressed the gold pen down firmly, adding a dramatic flourish to his final signature. He dropped the expensive pen onto the polished table and let out a long, heavy sigh of absolute ultimate victory. He looked directly across the table at me with a sickeningly smug expression of pure total dominance. The lead corporate lawyer carefully gathered the massive stack of signed papers and formally stamped them with a heavy official corporate seal. "Congratulations, Preston," the elite lawyer said, offering a polite professional handshake. "You are now the sole legal owner of the entire Caldwell corporate enterprise. The massive $50 million acquisition funds will be officially released directly into your primary holding accounts by the end of the day." Richard let out a loud, joyful laugh and clapped his hands together. Catherine beamed with absolute aristocratic pride. They had won the ultimate war. I remained seated for a brief moment, completely absorbing the profound arrogance radiating from the Kensington family. Then I slowly pushed my leather chair back and stood up to my full commanding height. I looked directly at Preston and began to clap my hands together. It was a slow, heavy, deliberate clap that echoed sharply against the glass walls of the silent boardroom. The wealthy buyers looked at me with deep confusion. The smug smiles slowly began to completely melt off the faces of the Kensington family. They recognized the cold, absolute terror hiding behind my slow, methodical applause. "That was a highly impressive performance, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, lethal monotone. "You signed those legal documents with the eager desperation of a truly greedy amateur. You were in such a massive rush to steal my entire corporate empire that you failed to realize the basic, fundamental rule of absolute corporate law." Preston completely froze in his chair, his pale blue eyes darting nervously around the quiet room. "What are you talking about, Vernon?" he demanded, his voice cracking with sudden, intense fear. "I just legally took absolutely everything you own. You have nothing left." I stopped clapping and rested my hands flat against the polished mahogany table, leaning my body entirely forward. "You are absolutely correct, Preston," I whispered coldly. "You did just legally take absolutely everything. But when a parent company completely absorbs another corporate entity, they do not just absorb all the highly profitable physical assets. They also legally absorb every single hidden financial liability permanently attached to that specific corporate structure." I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored charcoal suit and pulled out a small black leather ledger. It was the exact financial ledger Marcus had secured from the deep, violent underground. I tossed the heavy black ledger directly across the long, shiny table. It slid rapidly across the smooth mahogany surface and stopped exactly in front of his trembling hands. Preston looked down at the dark book as if it were a highly venomous snake ready to strike. The entire room was completely paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying shift in power. "You see, Preston?" I continued, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "I did not just transfer my highly profitable logistics network to you today. I also included a very specific and highly toxic shell company that I personally acquired late last night. You just legally claimed ownership of the shell company that owes $12 million to the cartel. They are absolutely not looking for me anymore. They are looking for the legal owner. You." Preston grabbed the black leather ledger with trembling hands. His pale fingers fumbled awkwardly with the thick pages. He stared at the damning numbers printed in stark black ink. Richard lunged forward across the massive mahogany table. The arrogant, aristocratic facade completely melted away from his sweating face. They frantically searched the dense legal documents they had just eagerly signed. They were desperately looking for a hidden legal loophole to save their pathetic lives. They flipped through the heavy pages, tearing the expensive paper in their wild panic. But there was absolutely no escape to be found anywhere in the text. My corporate attorneys are some of the most brilliant and completely ruthless legal minds operating in the entire country. They had buried the toxic liability clause incredibly deep inside the complex financial restructuring language. It was practically invisible to an arrogant amateur who only saw massive dollar signs and easy wealth. Preston had legally bonded his entire financial existence and his future legacy to the massive cartel debt. The warm blood completely drained from Richard's aristocratic face as he slowly read the undeniable legal truth hidden in the fine print. He dropped the heavy papers onto the polished table as if they were physically burning his bare hands. He looked directly at his only son with a sickening mixture of absolute disgust and sheer primal terror. "You actually signed it," Richard whispered, his voice shaking violently in the quiet room. "You blindly signed away absolutely everything we have ever owned. You fell right into his trap like a complete fool." The elite corporate buyers sitting silently at the other end of the table were absolutely not foolish men. They were seasoned veterans of the cutthroat financial world. They immediately understood the severe gravity of the rapidly unfolding situation. The lead corporate buyer stood up slowly from his comfortable leather chair. His expression was a rigid mask of cold, professional fury. He looked directly at Preston with absolute, unadulterated contempt burning in his eyes. "We absolutely do not do business with common street criminals," the lead buyer stated, his voice echoing loudly in the silent corporate boardroom. "We were promised a perfectly clean, highly profitable corporate acquisition today. We were assured that your holding company was a pristine vessel for this massive transition, but you are actively involved in a massive illegal Ponzi scheme, and you apparently owe millions of dollars to a violent criminal syndicate." The buyer immediately signaled his expensive legal team to pack up their leather briefcases. He formally declared that their massive $50 million acquisition offer was completely null and void effective immediately due to gross fraudulent misrepresentation. They turned their backs on the terrified Kensington family without another word. They walked straight out of the heavy glass boardroom doors, leaving a cold void behind them. The massive fortune Preston thought he had finally secured vanished completely into thin air in less than 60 seconds. He was left with absolutely nothing but a worthless, bankrupt holding company and a massive lethal debt hanging directly over his head. But I was absolutely not entirely finished destroying them. I had promised to tear their arrogant family apart piece by piece, and I always keep my promises. I remained standing tall at my end of the long mahogany table, radiating absolute cold authority. "You actually thought the terrible consequences ended with the complete loss of my lucrative company?" I asked, my voice dropping to a freezing, lethal tone. "You deeply underestimated my absolute commitment to your complete financial and social ruin." I looked directly at Catherine and Richard, who were currently trembling in their expensive seats. "Your precious son needed a massive amount of heavy collateral to secure his initial desperate loans from the criminal underworld. The violent cartel does not just happily hand over $12 million based on a polite promise from a wealthy rich boy. Preston secretly pledged your massive historic family estate as the primary collateral for his massive illegal loans." Richard let out a loud, suffocating gasp that echoed in the large room. He clutched his chest, falling back heavily into his leather chair. "Our historic family home," Richard choked out, his pale eyes wide with profound, horrific realization. "It has been in our prestigious family for 4 generations. You cannot possibly take our ancestral home away from us." I smiled, a cold, dark, terrifying smile. "The ruthless cartel certainly would have taken it," I explained, smoothly leaning forward. "They would have burned it to the ground if they felt like it. But the cartel prefers liquid cash over complicated real estate transactions. So late last night, while you were busy holding my innocent daughter hostage in that very same house, I made a highly discreet phone call. My primary offshore bank completely and legally purchased the entire $12 million debt directly from the criminal syndicate. The cartel got their dirty money in full and walked away completely satisfied. And my offshore bank officially acquired the exclusive legal rights to your massive debt portfolio, which means Preston does not owe the violent street cartel anymore. He currently owes me. And since he has absolutely no liquid cash left to pay me back, my corporate holding company is officially seizing your grand historic estate right now. You are completely homeless, Richard. I own the very roof over your arrogant head. I own the beautiful manicured lawns and the expensive antique furniture. I own absolutely everything you have ever valued in your pathetic, superficial life." Before Richard could even begin to fully process the absolute total destruction of his ancient aristocratic legacy, a sharp, buzzing sound brutally interrupted the heavy silence. Catherine reached a violently trembling hand into her expensive designer handbag. She pulled out her sleek modern mobile phone. The bright digital screen was completely flooded with an endless rapid stream of urgent automated banking notifications. She stared at the glowing screen, completely paralyzed by sheer, overwhelming panic. "What is it?" Richard demanded, his voice breaking completely, sounding like a frightened child. Catherine slowly looked up, her pale blue eyes welling with terrified tears, ruining her perfect, expensive makeup. "Every single one of our premium elite credit cards is completely declining," Catherine whispered, her voice trembling wildly. "The bank is sending continuous emergency fraud alerts right now. All of our private checking accounts and our massive generational investment portfolios are completely frozen by federal order." I nodded slowly, confirming her absolute worst nightmare. "You can actually thank Marcus for that," I stated calmly, crossing my arms. "My brilliant forensic accountant did not just find the undeniable proof of Preston's massive financial fraud. He formally submitted the entire mountain of damning digital evidence directly to the federal authorities early this morning. The federal government takes a very harsh, unforgiving stance on massive multi-million-dollar Ponzi schemes that defraud wealthy citizens. They have officially frozen every single financial asset connected to your corrupt family name, pending a massive detailed criminal investigation. You do not even have enough money left in the world to buy a cheap cup of coffee on the street. Your country club memberships are completely worthless. Your wealthy elite friends will completely abandon you the second they see the evening news. You are entirely destitute." Maya sat perfectly still in her chair, watching the entire arrogant family completely crumble into dust. She did not shed a single tear for the pathetic man she once called her loving husband. She watched Preston weeping openly on the floor of the corporate boardroom, and she felt absolutely nothing but pure, righteous relief. She looked across the long mahogany table and met my steady gaze. She gave me a small, firm nod of absolute solidarity. We had successfully survived the darkest, most terrifying storm of our entire lives. I looked down at the wealthy parents who had arrogantly tried to steal my only child and destroy my hard-earned legacy. Richard was completely hyperventilating, clutching his chest in genuine physical agony, while Catherine sobbed hysterically into her completely worthless diamond hands. They had built their entire false lives on a foundation of pure arrogance and unearned privilege, and now that fragile foundation was completely, utterly annihilated. Preston finally snapped under the immense, crushing pressure. The terrifying reality of his absolute total defeat completely broke his fragile, cowardly mind. He let out a loud, pathetic, sobbing whimper that sounded entirely inhuman. He violently pushed himself away from the polished mahogany table, knocking his heavy leather chair backward onto the floor with a loud crash. He turned frantically toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, desperately trying to physically run away from the massive, terrifying consequences of his own boundless greed. He thought he could simply run out of the building and disappear into the crowded city streets, but he did not even make it halfway across the large room. The tall glass doors suddenly swung open with incredible, forceful authority, blocking his only exit. Preston slammed to a complete halt, his pale, sweating face turning the color of dead ash. A highly coordinated team of stern federal agents marched aggressively into the boardroom. They wore dark tactical jackets with bold yellow letters across their broad chests. They moved with absolute military precision. The lead federal agent stepped directly into Preston's path, completely blocking his pathetic, cowardly escape. Preston Kensington, the lead agent, commanded, his deep voice echoing with absolute, undeniable authority throughout the entire room. "We have official federal warrants for your immediate arrest. You are currently being charged with massive systemic wire fraud, severe corporate embezzlement, and felony conspiracy to commit murder. Turn around and place your hands directly behind your back right now." The heavy glass doors of the boardroom remained wide open as the stern federal agents flooded into the room. Their dark jackets absorbed the bright morning sunlight pouring through the large windows. The lead agent stepped firmly toward Preston, who was frozen in absolute terror. Preston desperately tried to stumble backward away from the authorities, but his weak, trembling legs completely failed him. He collapsed heavily onto the plush carpet of the corporate boardroom, letting out a pathetic gasp. Two large federal agents immediately grabbed his tailored arms and hoisted him forcefully back onto his shaking feet with absolute authority. They aggressively twisted his arms behind his back, pinning him securely against their bodies. The loud metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs echoed violently through the entirely silent room. Preston cried out in sudden physical agony as the cold, tight metal clamped down brutally against his severely injured right wrist. He was weeping openly and uncontrollably, now completely stripped of his arrogant, superficial superiority. The beautiful, flawless illusion of his wealthy, untouchable, aristocratic life was entirely and permanently shattered into jagged pieces. He looked frantically toward his powerful parents, expecting them to magically save him from this terrifying nightmare. He desperately hoped they would use their massive generational wealth and vast high society connections to stop the arrest. But the dark, devastating reality of their absolute total destruction was finally setting in. The lead federal agent began loudly reading him his official rights. The severe criminal charges of massive systemic wire fraud and severe corporate embezzlement hung incredibly heavily in the tense air. But it was the final devastating charge of felony conspiracy to commit murder that completely broke the remaining fragile silence in the room. Richard Kensington stood paralyzed beside the polished mahogany table, staring blankly straight ahead. He looked down at his weeping, handcuffed son, and then looked directly at the stern, unforgiving faces of the armed federal agents. The wealthy, aristocratic patriarch did not step bravely forward to defend his only biological child. He did not loudly demand to call his high-priced corporate defense attorney or threaten the authorities with massive lawsuits. Instead, the absolute pathetic cowardice of the ancient Kensington bloodline fully revealed itself for the entire world to witness. Richard aggressively took 2 large, desperate steps completely away from his crying son, trying to physically distance himself from the immediate, massive legal danger. He raised his violently trembling hands high into the air, completely surrendering his false aristocratic dignity and his fake paternal loyalty. "I had absolutely nothing to do with any of this terrible criminal activity," Richard shouted, his voice cracking wildly with pure, pathetic, primal panic. "It was all his doing entirely. My son is completely out of his fragile mind. He has been running that illegal financial business entirely on his own without my knowledge. I never knew anything about the violent cartel debt or the poisoned wine at the restaurant. I am a highly respected and honorable, wealthy man. You cannot possibly arrest an innocent man for the psychotic, violent crimes of this pathetic, foolish boy," Richard pleaded desperately. Preston stopped crying for a tiny fraction of a second and stared directly at his cowardly father in profound, absolute, paralyzing shock. The deep, unshakable familial loyalty they constantly bragged about at their highly exclusive private country clubs was proven to be a complete, fragile, pathetic lie. When the terrifying, dark reality of federal prison finally appeared right in front of them, Richard instantly threw his own flesh and blood directly under the massive speeding bus without any single hesitation. He simply wanted to desperately save his own miserable, worthless skin. Catherine Kensington watched in absolute sheer horror as her wealthy husband completely and ruthlessly betrayed their only beloved son in front of the entire corporate audience. Her pale, flawless face twisted violently into a dark, terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated hatred and absolute disgust. She stepped incredibly quickly toward Richard and forcefully raised her manicured right hand high into the air. The loud, sharp, explosive sound of her open palm brutally striking his cheek echoed violently across the massive corporate boardroom, completely shocking every single standing person present there. She slapped her arrogant husband with such incredible vicious force that Richard actually stumbled backward and crashed heavily into a thick leather executive chair. "You pathetic, disgusting, weak coward!" Catherine screamed, her voice turning incredibly shrill and entirely unhinged in her absolute panic. "You knew absolutely everything about the entire situation from the very beginning. You personally helped him plan the entire complex financial cover-up to save our failing estate." Richard held his bright red, stinging cheek, completely speechless and entirely paralyzed by her sudden, violent physical outburst. The pristine, arrogant white family was completely turning on each other. They were attacking one another like terrified, cornered rats trapped desperately in a rapidly sinking ship. Catherine spun around wildly to face the stern federal agents, her expensive, heavy diamond earrings shaking violently against her pale neck. She was completely consumed and entirely blinded by pure, desperate, selfish panic. She foolishly believed that if she loudly told the federal authorities the absolute truth, they would somehow magically grant her complete legal immunity. She pointed a violently trembling manicured finger directly at her weeping, handcuffed son, entirely willing to completely destroy him in order to perfectly save her own personal freedom. "He completely forced us into this terrible situation," Catherine screamed hysterically, her voice cracking loudly under the immense crushing pressure of the moment. "He told us he was completely financially bankrupt. He told us all about the massive $20 million life insurance policy he secretly took out on Vernon. He promised us that if the dangerous poison worked perfectly at the steakhouse, all our massive financial problems would magically disappear forever. We only went along with the terrible murder plan because he constantly threatened to drag our prestigious ancient family name into the filthy public mud forever without mercy." The entire corporate boardroom immediately fell into a state of absolute, stunned, paralyzing silence. The remaining elite corporate executives who had not yet fled the chaotic room stared at the wealthy aristocratic matriarch in pure, profound, sheer horror. Catherine had just completely involuntarily confessed to a massive premeditated murder plot in a room completely full of armed federal agents and highly credible corporate witnesses. The lead federal agent slowly and deliberately pulled out a small black official notepad and documented her hysterical screaming confession word for word, exactly as she had loudly yelled it to the entire quiet room. Catherine suddenly and violently realized the massive, fatal, catastrophic mistake she had just foolishly made. She quickly covered her pale mouth with both of her violently trembling hands, but the terrible, damning words were already permanently recorded in the official federal criminal record. She had completely and entirely sealed the absolute total destruction of her entire aristocratic family with her own mouth. Maya stood up incredibly slowly from her comfortable leather executive chair. She calmly smoothed the front of her simple dark dress and walked gracefully around the massive long mahogany table, completely ignoring the heavy, terrifying chaos surrounding her. She moved with the quiet, elegant, powerful grace of a strong, independent woman who had completely and finally reclaimed her own absolute personal power. She walked directly up to her crying, handcuffed husband, completely ignoring his pathetic whimpering. Preston looked up at her with pathetic, desperate, pleading eyes, silently begging for a tiny ounce of forgiveness or basic human sympathy. Maya did not scream angrily at him or shed a single solitary tear for his terrible, pathetic fate. She calmly reached down and smoothly pulled the heavy, expensive diamond wedding ring completely off her left hand without any slight hesitation. She stared deeply and coldly into his terrified, pale blue eyes and dropped the sparkling diamond ring directly into the front pocket of his expensive, ruined gray suit jacket. "Enjoy the $50 million, Preston," Maya said, her voice completely cold, firm, and entirely devoid of any human emotion. "I hear the daily commissary in federal prison is incredibly expensive." The stern federal agents forcefully grabbed Preston by his tailored shoulders and began to march him aggressively toward the heavy glass exit doors. Two other armed agents stepped quickly forward, holding cold, tight steel handcuffs ready for the guilty parents. They placed the metal cuffs directly onto the pale wrists of Richard and Catherine. The wealthy couple sobbed loudly, unable to fully comprehend their sudden, devastating fall from power. As the federal agents forcefully pulled Richard toward the exit, the broken man dug his expensive shoes deeply into the plush carpet. He stopped moving completely and turned his head to look directly at me. His pale eyes burned with pure, unadulterated, venomous hatred. "This is absolutely not over yet, Vernon," Richard screamed wildly. "We have friends in high places." "I own your friends, Richard," I calmly replied, completely smiling back. 2 days had passed since the massive corporate boardroom trap successfully closed around the arrogant Kensington family. The federal authorities had formally granted Richard and Catherine a temporary release on bail pending their upcoming criminal trial. But their precious physical freedom meant absolutely nothing because their entire financial reality had been completely obliterated. I drove my dark sedan slowly down the quiet, pristine streets of the highly exclusive Oakbridge neighborhood. The towering oak trees cast long, cold shadows across the perfectly manicured green lawns of the elite community. I parked my car directly across the street from the massive historic Kensington estate and turned off the engine. I sat comfortably in the warm leather driver's seat and watched the absolute final act of their total destruction unfold right in front of my eyes. 3 massive moving trucks were parked aggressively in the long circular driveway. A large team of professional liquidators and court-appointed movers were actively carrying heavy pieces of expensive antique furniture out of the grand front doors. They were systematically emptying the beautiful generational mansion piece by piece, completely stripping the wealthy family of their ancient inherited legacy. The heavy mahogany tables, the rare imported silk rugs, and the priceless historic oil paintings were all being carelessly loaded into the dark cavernous backs of the moving trucks. The massive bank I secretly controlled had officially foreclosed on the sprawling property. The wealthy Kensington family was being formally and publicly evicted from their prestigious ancestral home. I watched the highly coordinated, chaotic scene with a deep sense of profound, quiet satisfaction. There were no loud corporate lawyers or arrogant public relations managers standing aggressively on the pristine lawn to protect them today. The terrifying federal criminal charges of severe wire fraud and massive corporate embezzlement had completely terrified their elite social circle. Every single one of their wealthy country club friends and powerful political allies had immediately and completely abandoned them to save their own pristine reputations. The Kensingtons were entirely alone, forced to publicly face the devastating, brutal consequences of their own boundless, blinding greed. I looked closely at the edge of the wide stone driveway and saw Catherine Kensington. She was sitting awkwardly on a single small designer leather suitcase, completely surrounded by the chaotic moving process. She was wearing a highly expensive snow-white cashmere coat and large dark sunglasses to hide her swollen, tear-stained face. But the expensive designer clothing looked completely ridiculous and entirely pathetic on her now. The flawless, aristocratic matriarch who had viciously threatened to destroy my entire life and steal my innocent daughter was currently weeping openly on the cold, hard concrete sidewalk. Her heavy diamond earrings were completely gone, confiscated by the federal authorities as illicit criminal evidence. Her rare imported crocodile skin handbag sat empty and completely worthless by her trembling feet. The massive credit cards inside were permanently frozen, and her elite banking accounts were entirely drained. She watched in absolute sheer horror as a burly mover carelessly carried her favorite antique porcelain vase out the front door and shoved it roughly into the dark truck. She let out a loud, pathetic, sobbing wail, but absolutely nobody stopped to comfort her or offer her a warm, sympathetic shoulder. Several wealthy neighbors from the surrounding massive mansions were standing quietly on their perfectly manicured lawns, watching the humiliating eviction unfold. They did not walk over to help their former friends. They simply stood at a safe distance, whispering quietly to each other and completely enjoying the spectacular public downfall of the arrogant family. Catherine noticed the judgmental stares of her wealthy peers and buried her pale face deeply into her trembling hands, completely crushed by the profound, crushing weight of her absolute total social ruin. She had spent her entire miserable, superficial life looking down on people like me, and now she was the ultimate pathetic spectacle for the entire elite neighborhood to openly mock and heavily pity. Then I saw Richard Kensington slowly emerge from the heavy wooden front doors of the empty mansion. He did not look like the proud, arrogant, conquering general who had aggressively confronted me in the sterile hospital waiting room just a few days ago. He looked like a completely broken, defeated, and severely aged man. His expensive, custom-tailored navy suit was heavily wrinkled and covered in light gray dust from the chaotic moving process. His thick, silver hair was highly unkempt and wildly out of place. His broad shoulders were slumped deeply forward, completely carrying the massive, invisible weight of his entire destroyed ancestral legacy. He stopped at the top of the wide stone steps and looked around the busy driveway with a hollow, empty stare. He watched the ruthless liquidators carry the last remaining pieces of his proud aristocratic history into the massive trucks. He had absolutely nothing left to his ancient, prestigious name. His only biological son was currently sitting alone in a cold, terrifying federal prison cell, completely unable to post his own massive bail. His massive fortune was entirely gone, and his beautiful, historic estate was officially owned by the very man he had deeply despised and heavily underestimated. Richard slowly turned his tired head and suddenly noticed my dark sedan parked quietly across the pristine street. He stared directly at my car for a long, heavy moment. The burning, venomous hatred and absolute arrogant pride that had previously defined his entire pathetic character were completely extinguished. He looked entirely hollowed out and completely spiritually dead. He slowly walked down the wide stone steps, moving with the stiff, painful, mechanical gait of a deeply broken man. He walked past his weeping wife without saying a single comforting word. He crossed the quiet, pristine street, walking directly toward my parked vehicle. I did not lock my car doors or nervously roll up my tinted window. I simply sat comfortably in the warm driver's seat, resting my hands calmly on the smooth leather steering wheel, waiting patiently for him to completely approach. Richard stopped exactly 2 feet away from my open car window. He looked incredibly small and entirely pathetic, standing alone in the cold morning air. His pale blue eyes were completely red and heavily bloodshot from 2 straight days of absolute sheer panic and endless crying. He placed his trembling hands respectfully behind his back, completely assuming the submissive physical posture of a deeply defeated beggar. "Vernon," he whispered, his aristocratic voice cracking severely, sounding incredibly weak and profoundly desperate. He did not use his usual harsh, commanding tone or attempt to hurl deeply coded racist insults at my face. He spoke to me with the absolute total reverence of a desperate man praying to a silent, unforgiving God. "We have absolutely nothing left. Vernon," Richard said, his voice trembling violently in the cold wind. "The federal government seized every single bank account and frozen all of our liquid assets. We do not even have enough physical cash to buy a cheap hot meal or rent a dirty motel room for the night. All of our wealthy friends have completely turned their backs on us. Nobody will even answer my urgent phone calls anymore." I looked directly into his desperate, pleading eyes, completely absorbing the absolute magnitude of my final flawless victory. "You built your entire superficial life on a highly fragile foundation of pure, blinding arrogance and unearned financial privilege," Richard first replied, my voice completely calm and entirely devoid of any human sympathy. "You deeply believed your ancient family name made you completely invincible to the harsh, brutal consequences of your own terrible actions. You brutally tried to steal my entire corporate fortune and violently destroy my innocent family. Now you are finally experiencing the absolute, dark, terrifying reality of the very world you so proudly looked down upon." Richard completely lowered his proud head, staring deeply at the cold, hard asphalt street. "I am begging you, Vernon," he cried openly, hot tears spilling freely down his pale, wrinkled cheeks. "I am completely setting aside all my personal pride and begging you for a small fraction of human mercy. Please just give us a small personal loan. Just enough money to rent a cheap small apartment in the city until the massive criminal trial begins. We have absolutely nowhere else to go." I watched the powerful aristocratic patriarch completely humiliate himself right in front of my eyes. The silent adjustment was finally and absolutely complete. I slowly reached my right hand into the inside pocket of my tailored charcoal suit jacket. I pulled out my thin leather wallet and carefully extracted a single crisp $20 bill. I reached my arm out the open window and held the small green paper directly in front of his tear-stained face. Richard looked at the small denomination with profound, deep confusion and sheer absolute shock. He slowly reached out his trembling hand and took the $20 bill from my fingers. I looked deeply into his completely broken soul. "Take a cab to the homeless shelter downtown," I instructed, my voice dropping to a freezing, lethal tone. "I built it 10 years ago. Tell them Vernon sent you. They will give you a warm cot." I slowly rolled up the tinted glass window, completely cutting off his pathetic, desperate sobbing. I put the car in drive and smoothly pulled away from the curb, leaving the entirely destroyed Kensington family behind me in the cold, dark dust forever. The atmosphere in my grand corporate boardroom felt entirely different this time. The dark, oppressive shadow of the Kensington family had been completely and permanently eradicated from my professional life. Sitting across from me at the polished mahogany table were the elite corporate buyers who had initially frozen the massive $50 million transaction. They had carefully watched the spectacular public downfall of Preston and his corrupt aristocratic parents on the national evening news. The buyers completely understood the brilliant, ruthless tactical trap I had flawlessly executed to legally transfer the massive cartel debt and completely annihilate the fraudulent holding company. They did not view me as a vulnerable old man anymore. They looked at me with profound, deep professional reverence and absolute undeniable respect. The lead corporate buyer leaned forward and formally offered his most sincere personal apologies for temporarily doubting my supreme business acumen. He stated clearly that any man who could successfully outmaneuver a violent criminal syndicate and completely dismantle a massive high society fraud scheme was a man they desperately wanted to do major business with. The massive, complex legal paperwork was quickly and respectfully distributed across the long, smooth table. I picked up my favorite heavy silver pen and calmly signed my name on the final signature line. The official massive corporate acquisition was completely finalized in less than 20 short minutes as I watched them pack their briefcases. By early afternoon, my private wealth management banker called to proudly confirm that the entire $50 million had successfully cleared all international banking hurdles and safely landed in my primary secure trust accounts. My massive life legacy was completely restored and protected. I had successfully defended the corporate empire I built from the freezing streets of the south side of Chicago. But securing the massive financial fortune was only the very first step in completely rebuilding my shattered world. True power is not just about aggressively destroying your absolute worst enemies. It is also about profoundly elevating the fiercely loyal people who stood bravely beside you when the dark, terrifying storm was at its absolute worst. I asked my private driver to take me directly to the quiet local coffee shop near the university campus. Trey was sitting patiently at a small wooden corner table studying complex architectural blueprints for his upcoming college exams. When I walked through the glass door, the young man immediately stood up, completely abandoning his heavy textbooks out of deep, genuine respect. I told him to please sit down, and I smoothly slid into the wooden chair directly across from him. I ordered 2 cups of hot black coffee and looked deeply into the bright, hopeful eyes of the incredibly brave young man who had completely saved my life at the high-end steakhouse. Trey did not ask me for a massive financial reward or brag loudly about his vital tactical role in the dark, dangerous raid at the sprawling Kensington estate. He simply asked me if my beautiful daughter was completely safe and finally recovering from her massive emotional trauma. I smiled a warm, genuine smile, completely moved by his pure, unselfish character. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, crisp manila envelope. I slid it slowly across the small wooden table, completely mirroring the exact same smooth motion Marcus had used to hand me the damning financial evidence days ago. I told Trey to open the heavy envelope. His young hands trembled slightly as he pulled out 2 certified bank checks. The first massive check was specifically calculated to completely pay off his entire architectural college tuition and cover his daily living expenses for the next 4 years. He would never, ever have to work grueling double shifts at the restaurant again. The second incredibly large check was generous seed money to officially start his very own high-end restaurant when he successfully graduated. Trey stared down at the massive financial sums, completely paralyzed by sheer shock. Tears of overwhelming gratitude quickly filled his young eyes. He tried to firmly reject the massive fortune, claiming it was simply too much money for doing the right thing. I raised my hand and gently stopped his humble protests. I told him that absolute loyalty and pure moral courage are the rarest currencies in the entire world. I told him he had fully earned every single penny and that I completely expected a premium front row table at his grand restaurant opening. I left the quiet coffee shop feeling a deep, profound sense of complete spiritual peace and returned directly to my warm, secure apartment. Maya was waiting patiently for me in the large, comfortable living room. She was wearing a simple, soft gray sweater and looking out the large, bright window at the sprawling city skyline. The dark purple bruise on her cheek was slowly beginning to heal, fading away, just like the terrible, painful memories of her completely disastrous marriage. She turned around when she heard my heavy leather shoes against the hardwood floor. She looked incredibly fragile, but also profoundly incredibly strong. We sat down together on the plush white sofa. The heavy, oppressive silence that had plagued our relationship for years was completely gone, replaced by a warm, comfortable understanding. Maya looked deeply into my tired, older eyes and began to softly cry. She did not cry the frantic, desperate tears of a terrified victim anymore. She cried the quiet, healing tears of a deeply repentant daughter. She formally apologized to me for her absolute, profound blindness. She apologized for foolishly believing the vicious, toxic lies Preston had carefully planted in her mind, and for aggressively defending a complete monster who wanted to legally murder me for a paycheck. She told me she felt completely ashamed for ever doubting my deep, unconditional paternal love, and for allowing the arrogant, aristocratic family to poison her heart against her own father. I reached out and gently took her soft, warm hands in my large, calloused hands. I did not offer her a loud, arrogant lecture or demand endless, pathetic apologies. I simply held her hands tightly and offered her my complete, absolute, unconditional forgiveness. I explained to my beautiful daughter that predators like Preston are incredibly skilled at completely isolating their targets and manipulating their absolute deepest insecurities. I told her that she was completely innocent and that I would fight 100 violent wars to keep her totally safe from any harm. I looked at her tear-stained, smiling face and told her the absolute deepest truth of my entire long existence. I told her that the massive $50 million corporate payout meant absolutely nothing to me in the grand scheme of the universe. I explained that true lasting wealth is not measured by massive offshore bank accounts or sprawling historic mansions or expensive fake designer clothes. True ultimate wealth is simply the absolute physical safety of your family and the deep, unbreakable bond of pure, genuine love you share with them. The massive financial fortune was merely a useful tool to secure our peaceful future together. We sat quietly on the comfortable sofa holding hands and completely healing our fractured souls. The dark, terrifying shadows of the past were completely banished forever. Early the very next morning, I sat alone at my large oak desk enjoying a hot cup of black coffee and sorting through my daily personal mail. My private assistant had carefully placed a small plain white envelope at the very top of the massive stack. I looked closely at the return address printed cheaply in the upper left corner. It was officially stamped by the Federal High Security Correctional Facility located upstate. The letter was directly from Preston, Kensington. I stared at his familiar, messy handwriting, feeling absolutely no anger and no pity. Oh, I knew exactly what pathetic, desperate words were written on the cheap-lined paper inside. He was undoubtedly begging wildly for my ultimate forgiveness and crying completely about the harsh, brutal realities of his cold, terrifying prison cell. He was probably begging me to use my massive wealth to hire him a decent defense lawyer because his completely bankrupt parents could not afford to help him anymore. He wanted a tiny shred of mercy from the exact same man he had coldly attempted to violently murder. I did not even bother to open the cheap white envelope. I simply picked it up and fed it directly into the heavy mechanical paper shredder sitting quietly next to my desk. I listened to the loud, satisfying grinding sound as his pathetic final words were completely destroyed into tiny, meaningless strips of white paper. The absolute justice I had meticulously engineered was finally complete. They were entirely eradicated from our peaceful lives and securely locked away from civil human society forever. I took another slow, warm sip of my hot, dark, rich coffee and completely embraced the quiet, radiant morning light shining freely down upon my tired face. 1 year has passed since the heavy glass doors of the corporate boardroom closed on the arrogant Kensington family forever. I am fully retired now. I spend my quiet mornings sitting peacefully on the wide wooden porch of my beautiful new home located just outside the busy city limits. The fresh morning air is incredibly clean and the surrounding green forest is deeply tranquil. I no longer wake up to the frantic ringing of corporate mobile phones or the heavy, crushing demands of building a massive nationwide logistics empire. I wake up to the gentle sound of singing birds and the warm, golden sunlight filtering through the tall, ancient oak trees. My beautiful daughter Maya is absolutely thriving in her brand new life. She completely severed all legal and emotional ties to her toxic past and legally changed her last name back to mine. Using the massive, secure financial trust I established for her, she successfully launched her very own charitable foundation. She spends every single day passionately funding vital educational programs for underprivileged children growing up on the rough, dangerous streets of the south side of Chicago. She is completely transforming the very same forgotten neighborhoods where I fought so desperately to survive my own violent youth. She has found her true noble purpose, and watching her walk proudly in the bright light of her own powerful independence brings me the greatest absolute joy I have ever known. We have a standing dinner date every single Sunday evening. We cook healthy meals together, we laugh freely, and we never ever speak the dark disgraced name of her former husband. She is completely safe and completely whole again. I personally funded a massive new community center in my old neighborhood. We built safe, modern playgrounds, beautiful, sprawling libraries, and advanced computer laboratories for the teenagers. I frequently visit the center to speak directly with the young boys and girls who are currently struggling just like I once did. I tell them to completely ignore the harsh, cruel voices that constantly tell them they are inherently worthless. I teach them the supreme value of intense focus, profound inner strength, and unwavering self-respect. Seeing their bright, eager faces completely fills the quiet, empty spaces in my old, aging heart. My financial fortune is no longer just a cold numerical balance in a secure offshore bank account. It is a powerful living, breathing force for positive change dedicated to fiercely uplifting the marginalized. The highly publicized federal criminal trial of Preston Kensington was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. The mountain of damning digital financial evidence provided by Marcus was entirely indisputable. Preston attempted to aggressively blame his wealthy parents for the massive illegal fraud scheme, but his pathetic, cowardly lies completely fell apart under the intense federal cross-examination. The stern federal judge sentenced him to 25 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. He will spend the absolute best years of his miserable adult life locked inside a tiny, cold concrete cell, completely surrounded by the exact same violent, hardened criminals he always arrogantly looked down upon. He has absolutely no access to expensive tailored suits or high-end luxury vehicles. His entire pathetic existence is now strictly dictated by harsh, loud prison sirens and heavily armed guards. He is completely forgotten by the wealthy elite society he desperately tried to impress. The brutal, absolute downfall of Richard and Catherine Kensington was equally devastating and incredibly publicly humiliating. Since my offshore banking entity completely legally seized their sprawling historic ancestral estate, they were permanently thrown out onto the cold, unforgiving street. The federal government officially permanently seized every single remaining penny they had ever hoarded in their massive hidden offshore accounts to partially repay the countless innocent victims of their son and his massive Ponzi scheme. They are currently living together in a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable, noisy neighborhood on the far outer edges of the city. Richard, the former proud aristocratic patriarch, is currently working a grueling minimum wage job as a late-night security guard at a highly run-down commercial warehouse. He spends his long, cold nights sitting alone in a small, dirty booth watching blurry security monitors to earn just enough money to pay his cheap monthly rent. Catherine, the former flawless high society queen, is currently working long, exhausting hours as a simple retail cashier at a highly discounted grocery store. She stands on her tired, aching feet all day wearing a cheap polyester uniform, completely forced to politely bag groceries for the exact same working-class people she spent her entire miserable life actively despising. Their wealthy elite country club friends completely ostracize them, ignoring their desperate phone calls and totally pretending they never even existed. They are entirely invisible now. They are completely trapped in a suffocating, endless cycle of grueling, hard manual labor and deep, profound poverty. The terrifying silent adjustment completely destroyed their arrogant, superficial world and permanently replaced it with the harsh, brutal reality of absolute physical survival. I sit calmly in my comfortable wooden rocking chair and deeply reflect on the long, complex journey of my entire life. I started my existence with absolutely nothing. I was born into a highly segregated, prejudiced society that was completely fundamentally built to keep me permanently pinned down in the dark dirt. I grew up facing brutal systemic obstacles and constant, deep, unearned hatred simply because of the dark color of my skin. But I refused to let their blinding ignorance dictate my absolute final destiny. I worked exhausting, grueling double shifts loading heavy wooden crates on the freezing docks. I saved every single hard-earned penny and slowly built my massive logistics empire entirely from the ground up through pure, relentless discipline and unbreakable mental fortitude. I succeeded in a cutthroat corporate world where absolutely nobody wanted to see me win. I walked into their highly exclusive boardrooms and completely beat them at their own complex financial games. The wealthy Kensington family made the ultimate fatal mistake of looking at my humble working-class origins and assuming I was a highly vulnerable, uneducated target. They completely underestimated the deep, profound, terrifying strength that is naturally forged in the hot fires of true adversity. They thought my quiet, patient demeanor was a clear sign of severe mental weakness. They mistook my profound generosity toward my family for pathetic, senile vulnerability. They believed their ancient aristocratic pedigree and their massive inherited wealth made them completely untouchable. But I ultimately proved to them and to the entire watching world that a highly disciplined mind and pure absolute patience are far deadlier than any synthetic chemical poison. A violent, screaming man will always blindly reveal his strategic hand, but a silent, observing man will quietly build a massive, inescapable trap entirely in the dark. I completely dismantled their entire fraudulent empire, stripped them of their ancient stolen legacy, and permanently banished them to a lifetime of absolute crushing poverty without ever raising my calm, steady voice or throwing a single physical punch. I used their own massive, blinding hubris and their own pathetic, cowardly greed as the primary heavy weapons to completely execute their total financial and social annihilation. I did not just survive their brutal, cowardly assassination attempt. I completely redefined the absolute meaning of pure, righteous justice. The world is a highly dangerous place, completely filled with incredibly greedy, selfish predators who wear expensive designer suits and hide behind polite, fake smiles. But those vicious predators will always inevitably fall prey to the quiet, unassuming survivor who knows exactly how to patiently wait in the tall grass. The late afternoon sun slowly begins to set deeply behind the tall, ancient trees, casting a warm, beautiful golden glow across my wide wooden porch. The quiet, peaceful evening is finally approaching. I slowly stand up from my comfortable rocking chair and walk smoothly over to the small, elegant wooden table resting nearby. I pick up a beautiful, heavy crystal wine glass and a dusty, expensive bottle of premium vintage Merlot. It is the exact same rare, expensive vintage we were supposedly drinking on that terrible, chaotic night at the high-end steakhouse. But this specific bottle is completely pure and entirely untainted. I pour the dark red liquid into the crystal glass. I raise the glass high into the quiet, warm evening air. I look up at the beautiful painted colors of the sky, and I offer a silent, deeply profound toast to my beautiful late wife, Vivian. She was my true equal, and the first person who ever truly believed in my untamed potential. I promised her on her quiet deathbed that I would always fiercely protect our beautiful daughter and carefully guard the massive legacy we built together. I kept my sacred promise to her. The massive storm has passed and my life is restored. The silent adjustment is finally complete. True power is never loud. It does not demand the spotlight, nor does it seek validation from those who mistake arrogance for superiority. When you build your life through genuine struggle and daily discipline, your foundation becomes unshakable. People blinded by greed will always underestimate the quiet strength of patience. They assume kindness is weakness and silence is ignorance. But a wise man lets his enemies dig their own graves with their hubris. You cannot buy class and you cannot steal a legacy. In the end, the most lethal weapon against betrayal is an absolutely calm and highly calculating mind. Did you enjoy my story? Please let me know in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to my channel for more life stories. See you next time.